On my 32nd birthday, my parents extended an invitation for dinner at a distinguished three-Michelin-star establishment in Manhattan. The evening's proceedings were conspicuously devoid of gifts, cake, or indeed, any candles. Instead, prior to the arrival of the appetizers, my father unceremoniously placed a substantial stack of legal documents upon the immaculate white tablecloth. My mother then proceeded to take a slow, measured sip of her fine champagne, met my gaze directly, and whispered that my continued presence in their lives had been solely for the tax advantages. She declared that I had outlived my utility and that the time had come for me to execute the disownment papers. Not a single tear escaped my eye. I simply offered a smile, tapped my nails rhythmically against the table, and prepared to systematically dismantle the opulent lifestyles they had curated using my name. My name is Ava. I am 32 years old, and I hold the position of Senior Fine Art Appraiser at a prestigious auction house here in New York City. Before I delve further into this narrative, please share your current location in the comments below. Kindly click like and subscribe if you have ever found yourself compelled to confront your toxic family members and demonstrate the extent of your acquired power. Growing up within our affluent Connecticut suburb, every aspect of the Miller family's existence was meticulously crafted to present a deceptive facade. My father, Charles, serves as the chief accounting officer for a formidable financial firm. In his view, every facet of human experience is quantifiable, categorizable, and ultimately reducible to an entry on a balance sheet. He never perceived me as a daughter. I was merely a line item, a variable in his ceaseless pursuit of maximizing his net worth. My mother, Lydia, a former model, anchors her entire reality in the prestige of country club status, designer labels, and the projection of an image of flawless perfection. When they extended the invitation for my birthday dinner, a small, naive part of me harbored a foolish hope that things might be changing. For years, our relationship had been characterized by a chilling detachment. I had independently managed my own life, successfully built my own highly successful career, and sought absolutely nothing from them. Nevertheless, they insisted on hosting this dinner at an exclusive restaurant where reservations are notoriously difficult to secure, often months in advance. The dining room exuded an atmosphere of refined elegance, with its subtle lighting, crystal chandeliers, and the hushed murmur of conversation among the city's elite. I was attired in a tailored designer suit, acquired with my own hard-earned commission. Upon my arrival at the table, neither my father nor my mother rose to greet me. They merely gestured for me to be seated. The waiter then proceeded to pour sparkling water into our crystal goblets before discreetly withdrawing. It was at this juncture that my father reached into his leather briefcase. He offered no birthday wishes. He did not inquire about my day. Instead, he produced a weighty manila folder and placed it directly beside my silver charger plate. The dull thud reverberated with more intensity than the classical music that graced the background ambiance. "Sign these," Charles commanded, his voice resonating with the same flat, authoritative tone he typically employed when instructing his corporate interns. "The pages requiring notarization have already been marked, and we have a private notary awaiting in the lobby. We will finalize this evening." I appraised the folder, then shifted my gaze back to the man who was responsible for half of my genetic makeup. "What exactly am I signing?" I inquired. My mother adjusted her diamond necklace, emitting a small, theatrical sigh, as if my question constituted an unforgivable imposition. "Kindly refrain from making this tedious," she instructed, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "It is precisely as we discussed with our wealth manager. These are formal disownment papers, accompanied by a complete waiver of any future claims to our estate." I remained perfectly still. The sheer audacity of orchestrating such an event in a public venue on my birthday was astonishing, even by their standards. Are you seriously suggesting you invited me to a birthday dinner solely to disown me? I asked, my voice maintained at a dangerously low volume to avoid attracting the attention of neighboring tables. Lydia lifted her champagne flute, the effervescence sparkling under the chandelier's glow. "Let us finally be entirely candid," she sneered, her impeccably painted lips contorting into a cruel smirk. "We only retained you for so long due to the tax advantages. Having a dependent child provided educational credits and head-of-household deductions during those initial years. Your father structured our filing strategically. It all served a financial purpose. You were a highly convenient tax shield, Ava, but you are now 32. Those IRS loopholes have since closed. You have entirely outlived your usefulness to this family." Her words were designed to shatter me, meticulously crafted to exploit every conceivable parental insecurity a child might harbor regarding affection. She desired tears. She yearned for a public scene, thereby validating her narrative of me as an unstable, emotional burden they needed to shed. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, approaching the conversation as if it were a corporate merger that had soured. "You have established your own career now," Charles added with chilling coldness. "You earn your own money appraising art for affluent individuals. You do not require us, and we certainly do not need you detracting from our financial flexibility. We intend to liquidate certain shared assets and restructure our portfolios. Having you legally separated from our estate will facilitate a much cleaner accounting process." I observed the thick dossier. They sought my erasure, legally, financially, and personally. They wished to sever all ties, likely to channel every asset they possessed to my younger brother Grant, the golden child, who had never undertaken a day of gainful employment and who consistently depleted their bank accounts, funding his extravagant lifestyle and clandestine gambling habits. I registered the cool texture of the upholstery beneath me. I felt the smooth surface of my water goblet. I was entirely grounded. Years prior, such a rejection would have plunged me into a debilitating spiral of depression. I would have pleaded for their affection. I would have scrutinized my actions, questioning what I had done wrong. I would have pondered my unlovable nature, wondering why my own parents viewed me as little more than a tax deduction. However, I was no longer that frightened, desperate young woman. I had become a professional, dedicating my days to uncovering forged artworks, tracing hidden provenances, and exposing fraudulent individuals who attempted to pass off counterfeit masterpieces as genuine. I possessed an innate ability to identify a counterfeit. And as I observed my parents, adorned in their expensive attire and posturing as American royalty, I recognized in them the most profound counterfeits of all. Not a single tear fell. I did not raise my voice. Methodically, I placed my hands on the table and began to tap my manicured fingernails against the pristine white linen. 1, 2, 3. A steady, rhythmic cadence. My mother's brow furrowed, clearly unsettled by my complete lack of a breakdown. "Cease that tapping," she hissed. "It is remarkably ill-mannered. Simply pick up the pen and sign the document so we may order our entrees in peace." I ceased tapping. I looked at the pen my father had positioned atop the folder. Then I met his gaze directly. I slid the heavy manila folder back across the table, observing its journey until it made contact with his water glass. "I will not be signing anything this evening," I replied, my voice smooth and lethally controlled. My mother affected a gasp of mock indignation. "You ungrateful little brat," she snapped. "We are your family. You owe us your compliance." I allowed a slow, calculated smile to spread across my face. "I owe you absolutely nothing," I stated quietly. "And as for the notion of family, that is a rather fascinating choice of words. It is remarkably opportune that you have broached the subject of family tonight, because my real family is seated at the adjacent table. My father emitted a harsh, barking laugh, dismissing my words entirely. He instructed me to cease speaking in riddles and to retrieve the pen. But before he could launch into another corporate lecture concerning compliance, a heavy hand was placed firmly on the back of my chair. I did not require visual confirmation to identify its source. The overpowering scent of expensive cologne and entitled desperation heralded my younger brother's arrival long before he spoke. Grant slid into the vacant seat beside our mother, drawing a stunningly beautiful woman down next to him. This was Bianca, his latest fiancée, an heiress to a shipping fortune, who appeared utterly out of her element dealing with the likes of my family. Grant adjusted his silk tie, a custom piece I knew cost more than my first car, and glared at me across the table. He offered no greeting. He did not wish me a happy birthday. He merely pointed a manicured finger at the manila folder. "Sign the damn papers, Ava," Grant demanded, his voice taut with an anxiety he was desperately attempting to conceal. "Bianca and I are to be married in 6 months. Her family requires a complete financial disclosure from our side before they finalize the prenuptial agreement. I will not permit your stubbornness to jeopardize my future. You need to be removed from the family ledger tonight." Lydia reached over and patted Grant's cheek, her demeanor softening entirely into one of absolute adoration. "Grant is quite right, darling," she cooed, casting a dismissive glance in my direction. "Bianca hails from a highly prominent family. They expect a certain degree of financial purity. We cannot have a wayward daughter with a mediocre salary complicating the asset transfers. We are liquidating several properties to purchase the newlyweds a penthouse on Park Avenue. Your presence on the estate documents represents a significant liability." I glanced at Bianca, who was engrossed in examining her enormous engagement ring, entirely oblivious to the financial machinations unfolding before her. Then I turned my attention back to my brother. Grant was 29 years old, yet he still expected our parents to pave his life with gold. He had failed out of 2 different business schools, launched 3 unsuccessful tech startups that my father had quietly bailed out, and possessed a gambling habit that was an open secret within our household. Yet, I was the liability. I reached out and opened the heavy manila folder, Elise the magnitude of his own impending ruin, and I looked at Bianca, whose expression had shifted from stunned horror to a dawning realization that she, too, was about to be entangled in this web of deceit. The air crackled with unspoken threats, a carefully orchestrated performance of familial coercion. I placed my wineglass back on the table with a soft click. Then I reached into my own minimalist clutch. I produced a small, sleek digital voice recorder and pressed the record button. The tiny red light glowed, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. "You are absolutely right, Mother," I said, my voice calm and unnervingly steady. "I have nothing to lose. And you," I turned to my father. "You are quite correct that my career is built on reputation, but you have fundamentally misjudged my capacity for self-preservation." I let my gaze sweep over each of them. Grant was sweating openly now, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. Bianca's face was pale, her hand clutched to her chest. "You want to ruin me?" I continued, a slow smile spreading across my face, far more genuine than any I had offered them in years. "You want to threaten me with financial ruin and professional blacklisting? You think I haven't anticipated this? You think I haven't prepared for the moment you would try to leverage my entire existence against me?" I gestured to the manila folder, then to the discreet voice recorder. "This," I said, tapping the folder, "is your attempt to transfer a $2 million tax liability and a federal crime onto me. This," I indicated the recorder, "is my insurance policy." My father's mask of control fractured entirely. His eyes widened, the calculating malice replaced by a flicker of raw panic. "What have you done?" he growled, his voice tight with a new, desperate urgency. My father, Charles Miller, I began, my voice amplified slightly by the recorder. Chief Accounting Officer for Sterling Financial Group, currently under IRS investigation for attempting to hide $2 million in untaxed income through a shell corporation, Apex Holdings LLC, established 14 years ago using my Social Security number and forged signature, and intending to shift liability for this fraud onto his 32-year-old daughter, Ava Miller, via a disownment document presented on her birthday. Lydia let out a strangled cry, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her mouth again. Grant was frozen, his eyes darting between me and his father. He further attempted to coerce me, I continued, my voice unhurried, by threatening to destroy my career in the fine art appraisal industry and blacklist me from all auction houses and galleries in the country, all to facilitate my brother, Grant Miller's, upcoming marriage to Bianca Sterling, whose family requires a clean financial record from the groom's side. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. The hushed chatter of the restaurant patrons seemed to recede. All eyes were now, subtly, on our table. The discreet maitre d' hovered nearby, sensing an escalating situation. You see, I said, looking directly at my father, my career is built on authenticity, on uncovering forgeries and exposing fraud. It seems I have inherited that particular skill set from you. And just as you used your professional connections to amass wealth and power, I have used mine to build a network of contacts who understand both the value of art and the importance of integrity. A few discreet phone calls were all it took to confirm the IRS's scrutiny of Apex Holdings, and to let certain collectors, those who value transparency above all else, know that a potential catastrophic tax fraud case was about to unfold. The very case that could implicate your reputation and taint the provenance of their collections. I let my gaze drift to Grant. And my brother, I said, a hint of pity creeping into my voice. You threatened my livelihood thinking it would force my hand, but the reality is, if my father is ruined, your inheritance, the one Bianca is so keen on, disappears. And if I go to prison, your wedding plans might need a rather significant adjustment, as your entire financial foundation would crumble. I stood up, the sound of my chair scraping against the floor momentarily silencing the nearby conversations. I carefully slid the manila folder, still unopened by me, back across the table towards my father. The notary can wait, I said, my voice carrying through the sudden hush. I will not be signing anything tonight. In fact, I believe the IRS would be far more interested in speaking with a certain chief accounting officer and his shell corporation. I have already made myself available for a full statement, along with this recording, should they wish to discuss their investigation further. Enjoy your appetizers. I, on the other hand, have a career and a conscience to protect. I turned, leaving the stunned, pale faces of my family behind. I did not look back. As I walked towards the exit, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The weight of years of manipulation and emotional blackmail had finally lifted. I had walked into a trap, but I had turned it into their undoing. My brother, oblivious to the fragile edifice of his life, was a fool. They believed they had me trapped. Their threats of professional ruin and social ostracism, they thought, would shatter my spirit and enforce my submission. They were utterly convinced I was just an isolated, defenseless woman, devoid of leverage or allies. I reached for the gold-plated pen, a gift from my father, and felt its substantial, expensive weight as I twirled it. My mother exhaled in relief, mistaking it for surrender to their extortion. Grant smirked, already calculating his impending inheritance. I placed the pen back on the table, directly atop the Declaration of Disownment. You're right about one thing, I stated. my voice resonating with unshakable certainty. I am an appraiser. My career is built on dissecting minutiae, unearthing obscured histories, and discerning the true worth of what people strive to conceal. But you are wrong about everything else. I shifted my chair back slightly. You think a single phone call can dismantle my career? You believe you can force me to absorb your monumental tax fraud simply because you assume I stand alone? You envision me here, defenseless, awaiting obliteration by your wealth and connections. I leaned forward, mirroring my father's aggressive stance, delivering the words that would trigger the Miller family's complete annihilation. That is a fascinating theory, I said, a cold, predatory smile spreading. But you made a catastrophic miscalculation tonight. You presumed I arrived unprepared. You assumed isolation. As I've said, you are gravely mistaken. My real family is seated with us, and he has heard every syllable of your extortion. I picked up the gold pen again. Its metal felt cold and heavy. My father exhaled sharply, genuinely believing in his victory. He thought his threats had finally broken me. My mother leaned back, taking a triumphant sip of champagne, envisioning a future free of the daughter who refused her shallow dictates, securing her golden boy's penthouse and a wealthy bride. Grant crossed his arms, flashing a smug grin at Bianca, playing the role of the future patriarch. They waited for the stroke of ink that would transfer $2 million in federal tax debt onto my name, binding me to a felony so they could preserve their pristine credit scores and country club memberships. I gazed at the pen's tip, then at the signature line on the disownment papers. The sheer audacity of their plan was almost admirable. It requires a particular brand of sociopath to invite their child to a Michelin-starred restaurant on their 32nd birthday, solely to serve a financial death sentence. Instead, a soft, genuine laugh escaped me. Not of hysteria or panic, but of absolute clarity. My father frowned, his thick gray eyebrows drawing into a hard line. "What's so funny?" he demanded, commanding me to sign before he lost his temper. I placed the gold pen squarely in the center of the manila folder and slid the entire stack of documents across the tablecloth. It bumped against my father's water glass, spilling a few drops onto the polished wood. "Unfortunately, I cannot sign this," I said, my voice perfectly level and conversational. The air at our table became crystalline. The restaurant's ambient noise faded, leaving only the palpable, suffocating tension radiating from my family. My mother slammed down her champagne flute. "Do not play games with us, Ava," she hissed, her eyes darting around the room, ensuring no one important witnessed this defiance. "You have no choice. Your father outlined the consequences. If you walk out of here without signing those papers, your career at the auction house is over. You will be blacklisted by Monday morning." I leaned back, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly in my lap. I met her gaze with the clinical detachment of an appraiser examining a shoddy forgery. "You truly believe you possess the power to destroy me?" I replied smoothly. "You think Charles can simply pick up his phone, call a few wealthy art collectors, and erase a decade of my hard work? You rely on intimidation because you have no actual leverage. Let me explain something, Mother. The billionaires who purchase fine art do not care about the gossip of a corporate accountant. They care about authenticity. They care about protecting their investments. My reputation is impeccable because I identify fraud. I expose fakes. And right now, I am looking at the biggest frauds I have ever encountered in my entire life." Charles's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He leaned across the table, his voice a low, threatening growl. "You arrogant, ungrateful child. The suit and business card don't make you invincible. I'll ruin you. You'll never work in this city again. I'll bury you in Apex Holdings litigation until you're begging to sign these papers just to escape federal prison." Grant slammed his fist on the table, Stop being stupid, Ava, just sign the damn thing. Bianca and I have a wedding to plan. Her family's waiting for the asset disclosures. You're ruining my life out of spite, refusing to do what's right for this family. Bianca looked horrified, pulling her hand away from Grant and sliding further down the banquette. She was finally seeing the monsters behind the designer labels. I turned to Grant. Your life is a house of cards. Grant, you're 29 and you've never paid your own rent. You gamble hundreds of thousands on crypto and sports bets, and you expect our parents to cover your tracks by stealing my identity? You aren't building a legacy. You're a parasite, and I won't spend a second of my life or a cent of my money protecting you from your pathetic choices. How dare you speak to your brother that way? Lydia shrieked, abandoning any pretense of volume control. We gave you everything. We are your family. Your family. I repeated the word, letting it hang like a guilty verdict. You only throw that word around as a shield. You claim we're a family when you need someone to absorb IRS debt. You claim we're a family when you need a scapegoat for your financial crimes. But when I was working 3 jobs and eating ramen for textbooks, I was just a tenant you charged rent. When I struggled with depression and anxiety in my 20s, I was an embarrassment you hid from your social circle. I picked up my sparkling water, took a calm sip, and set it down. You came here tonight thinking you held all the cards. You thought you could ambush me on my birthday with a financial execution and walk away clean. You thought I was isolated. You thought I had no resources, no backup, no one to defend me. Charles scoffed, adjusting his cuffs. You have no one, Ava. You alienated everyone with your stubbornness. You have no power here. I smiled, a cold, sharp smile that finally drained the color from my father's confident face. That, Charles, is a catastrophic miscalculation, I said softly. You assumed I was entirely alone, but what a coincidence. My real family is seated right at the table next to us. I gestured subtly toward the adjacent VIP booth. And he has been eagerly waiting to discuss your sudden interest in my asset allocation. The scrape of a chair from the VIP booth directly behind my father broke the dead silence. A man stood, dressed in a charcoal gray bespoke suit that screamed Savile Row, impeccably tailored to a tall, imposing frame. His silver hair was swept back with immaculate precision. He lifted his crystal tumbler of scotch, took a leisurely sip, and turned toward our table. Charles didn't look up. He assumed it was an inebriated patron or a lost tourist. When the man didn't move, Charles snapped his fingers, a gesture of profound disrespect usually reserved for junior accountants. "Excuse me," Charles barked, his face still flushed with anger. "This is a private family dinner. If you're looking for the restroom, it's down the hall. Otherwise, I suggest you return to your table before I have the maitre d' escort you out." The man didn't blink. He stepped past Charles, completely ignoring the threat, and walked to my side of the table. He looked down at the heavy manila folder beside my glass, then at me. "Good evening, Ava," he said, his voice a rich, resonant baritone that carried an unmistakable weight of supreme authority. "I apologize for interrupting your birthday dinner. I trust the appetizers were at least satisfactory before the extortion began." "The food was excellent, Harrison," I replied, offering a warm, genuine smile. "The company, however, has proven highly defective. I believe we are ready to proceed." Lydia slammed her hand on the table, her diamond bracelets clinking loudly. "Who on earth do you think you are?" she hissed, glaring at the man in the gray suit. "How dare you approach our table and speak to my daughter?" Charles called security. "This man is harassing us." Grant puffed his chest out, trying to impress Bianca, who was frozen in shock. "Hey, buddy," Grant sneered, rising slightly. "You heard my mother. Back off or I'll make you regret walking over here." Harrison slowly turned his head to look at my brother. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a sudden movement. He simply looked at Grant with the cold, clinical detachment a scientist might use for an insignificant insect. "Sit down, Grant," Harrison commanded softly. "Your bravado is entirely unearned and frankly embarrassing for everyone involved. I strongly suggest you remain silent while the adults are speaking. If you say one more word to me, I will personally ensure the federal authorities receive a full copy of your offshore cryptocurrency ledger by tomorrow morning." Grant fell back into his seat as if physically struck. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly pale white. Bianca stared, trembling. That was when my father finally looked closely at the man beside me. I watched the exact moment recognition hit Charles. It was beautiful, deeply satisfying. The arrogant corporate patriarch vanished in a heartbeat. His eyes widened in sheer terror. His jaw went slack. The vein in his neck stopped throbbing. He seemed to shrink into the banquette. "Brooks," Charles whispered, his voice trembling, stripped of power. "Harrison Brooks, what are you doing here?" I watched my father struggle to breathe. Charles worshipped money and feared only those who could take it away. In Manhattan's financial district, Harrison Brooks's name was spoken in hushed, terrified whispers. Harrison was the man billionaires called when greedy relatives tried to steal their fortunes. He was the legal equivalent of a firing squad. He didn't negotiate. He annihilated. And my father knew exactly who he was. Harrison buttoned his suit jacket, his gaze locking onto my father with lethal precision. "Good evening, Charles. It is fascinating to see you in person. You usually prefer to hide behind heavily redacted emails and offshore shell company filings. But yes, I am Harrison Brooks, and I am here because my client invited me to her birthday dinner." Lydia looked between my father and the man in the gray suit, utterly lost in the sudden shift of power. "Charles, who is this man? Why are you letting him speak to us this way? Tell him to leave." "Shut your mouth, Lydia," Charles snapped, pure panic bleeding into his words. He looked like a man on the edge of a cliff. Harrison offered a polite, utterly merciless smile to my mother. "Allow me to introduce myself, Mrs. Miller. I am Harrison Brooks, Senior Managing Partner at Brooks & Associates. We are a boutique law firm located right here in Manhattan. We specialize in high-net-worth estate litigation, federal tax defense, and the aggressive prosecution of irrevocable trust fraud. I am widely considered to be the most ruthless trust fund attorney on the Eastern Seaboard, and I am entirely at Ava's disposal." The word trust hung in the air, heavy and lethal. My father swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat breaking on his forehead. The manila folder containing his pathetic attempt at blackmail suddenly looked like a child's drawing next to the legal titan beside me. "Mr. Brooks," Charles stammered, wiping his forehead with a linen napkin. "This is a private family matter. We are simply having a discussion about estate planning. There is no need for your involvement. We are just asking Ava to sign a standard liability waiver." "A standard liability waiver?" Harrison repeated, his tone laced with razor-sharp mockery. He reached down and picked up the manila folder. He didn't open it. He simply held it as if it were contaminated waste. "You call a document attempting to transfer $2 million of federal tax debt from your fraudulent shell company onto your daughter a standard waiver. You call threatening to destroy her career at the auction house estate planning. Charles, you are not just a terrible father. You are a remarkably sloppy criminal." Lydia gasped, clutching her pearls in a dramatic display of feigned outrage. "Fraud? Charles, what is he talking about? We are a respectable family. We do not commit fraud." "Respect is earned, Lydia," Harrison said without looking at her. "And your family has none left. You sat here and told your daughter she was nothing but a tax break. You tried to extort her to pay for a penthouse for your son. I have heard every single word spoken at this table for the past 45 minutes. I have audio recordings. I have transcripts. I have enough evidence to bury this entire family under a mountain of federal indictments before the dessert menu even arrives. Harrison tossed the manila folder back onto the table. It slid and hit Charles's plate, knocking a piece of expensive silverware clattering to the floor. I reached out and flipped open the heavy stack of documents Harrison had provided. I slid a specific medical file across the table, stopping it directly in front of my father. "So, you committed a federal crime," I stated flatly. "You bribed a private psychiatrist named Dr. Eris Thorne. You paid him $50,000 from your corporate expense account to diagnose me with severe bipolar disorder and extreme emotional volatility. I was 17 and grieving the only person in this family who actually loved me. I was crying in my room. You used my grief as a weapon. You had me forcibly committed to a private psychiatric facility for 2 weeks. You drugged me. You kept me isolated from my friends and my teachers." Lydia's face drained of all color. She shrank back into the booth, her eyes wide with mounting terror. Charles was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he stared at the forged medical records bearing his signature. "You took those fabricated medical reports to a sympathetic judge," I continued, my voice rising just enough to command the entire space around our table. "You filed an emergency petition for a permanent conservatorship. You stood in a courtroom and swore under oath that I was completely unfit to manage my own life, let alone a massive financial estate. You convinced the court to grant you full fiduciary control over the Beatrice Sterling Irrevocable Trust. You stole my legal autonomy. You stole $30 million from your own grieving daughter." "That is a lie," Charles hissed, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper. He looked around the room, terrified that the wealthy patrons nearby were listening to his unraveling. "Those documents are forged. I acted in your best interest. You were out of control. We had to step in to protect you from yourself. You were a danger to this family." Harrison let out a short, dark laugh. "Protect her. Charles, I have the wire transfer receipts. I have the emails between you and Dr. Thorne discussing the exact medical terminology required to satisfy the judge. I have the signed affidavit from Dr. Thorne himself, who recently decided to cooperate fully with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. You did not protect your daughter. You executed a highly coordinated, premeditated conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and elder abuse by proxy." My mother slammed her hands over her ears, shaking her head side to side. "Stop it. Stop saying these things. We are a good family. We gave you everything. We bought you clothes. We put a roof over your head. You had no idea how to manage that kind of wealth. You would have squandered it. Your father invested it wisely. He grew the portfolio. He protected the family legacy." "Protected the family legacy?" I shot back, my voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You call laundering my inheritance through offshore accounts protecting the legacy? You call buying Grant luxury sports cars and funding his degenerate gambling habit a wise investment? Every single dollar you have spent over the past 15 years was stolen from me. The designer dress you are wearing right now, Lydia. Stolen. The Michelin star dinner you are trying to make me pay for. Stolen. The Park Avenue penthouse you promised to buy Grant and Bianca. Stolen." I looked directly at Grant. My brother was staring at his hands, his entire world shattering into a million jagged pieces. He had spent his entire life believing he was a self-made entrepreneur, a golden child destined for greatness. Now he was realizing he was nothing but a parasite feeding off a trust fund his father had violently stolen from his sister. "You are not a millionaire, Grant," I said coldly. "You are an accessory to grand larceny." Charles lunged forward across the table, his face contorted in a mask of absolute, unhinged fury. He grabbed the edge of the documents, trying to rip them away from me. "I will destroy you for this. I will hire the best defense attorneys in the country. I will drag you through the courts for decades until you are bankrupt and begging on the street. You have no idea who you are dealing with." Harrison effortlessly reached out and clamped his hand over my father's wrist. His grip was like a steel vice. Charles gasped in pain, his fingers immediately releasing the paperwork. "You are the one who has no idea who you are dealing with, Charles," Harrison said softly, his voice carrying a promise of total annihilation. "Because the theft of the trust fund is merely the civil litigation. We have not even discussed the criminal charges yet. We have not even discussed what happens when the men in suits arrive." Harrison released his iron grip on my father. Charles slumped back into his seat, rubbing his wrist, his chest heaving as the reality of his situation began to suffocate him. I didn't give them a single second to recover. I reached into the stack of documents and pulled out a separate, neatly bound packet of bank statements. These were not summary reports. These were granular, line-by-line transaction records from the Cayman accounts Charles thought were impenetrable. I slid the first highlighted page across the table, bypassing my parents entirely and stopping it right in front of Bianca. She stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. "Take a close look at that transaction, Bianca," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "Date of transfer, October 12th of last year. Amount, $240,000. Wired directly from the Beatrice Sterling Irrevocable Trust to a high-end jeweler in the Diamond District. Does that date ring a bell?" Bianca swallowed hard. Her eyes darted from the paper to the massive, flawless diamond resting on her left hand. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. I leaned forward, locking eyes with my brother, her terrified fiancé. "Grant told you he spent a year saving his bonuses from his tech startup to buy you that ring. He told your parents he was a self-made man ready to provide for a future wife. But that ring was not bought with sweat equity or startup capital. It was bought with stolen money. You are wearing $250,000 of my stolen inheritance on your finger." Bianca let out a quiet, horrified gasp. She yanked her hand back and held it against her chest, as if the diamond had suddenly turned red hot. Grant frantically reached for her, his polished facade completely disintegrating. "Bianca, do not listen to her," Grant pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "She is lying. Dad gave me an advance on my trust fund. It was family money. It was totally legitimate." I turned the page and tossed it on the table. "There's no family money, Grant. There's only my money. And here's a wire transfer from June to your Aston Martin. $180,000. And here's a list of deposits made into your offshore cryptocurrency accounts over the past 3 years to cover your massive gambling losses, a total of approximately $1.4 million. Every cent was funneled through shell corporations funded by my grandmother's inheritance." Bianca pulled away from Grant with such force she nearly knocked over her water glass. She stared at him with a mixture of absolute disgust and dawning realization. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You told my father you were an entrepreneur. You sat in our home and swore your portfolio was clean. You are nothing but a thief living off your sister's stolen money." Grant turned wildly toward our parents, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Tell her," he shouted at Charles. "Dad, tell her it was a legal transfer. Tell her you authorized it. You said the money was yours to distribute. You promised me my background check would be spotless before the wedding." Charles squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to look at the woman his son was supposed to marry. He knew any lie he told now would be instantly destroyed by the documents sitting on the table. Lydia tried to intervene, leaning across the table with a fake, placating smile that looked entirely deranged given the circumstances. "Bianca, darling, please calm down. This is just a terrible misunderstanding. Charles manages all the family assets. It is common for high-net-worth families to commingle funds for tax efficiency. Grant had every right to that money. We are all one family." I pulled out a third sheet of paper and slid it toward my mother. "One family," I echoed, my voice dripping with lethal sarcasm. "Is that what you told yourself last month when you booked that 3-week luxury ski vacation in Aspen? $85,000 for a private chalet and private jet charters, all billed to an LLC that derives 100% of its funding from the Beatrice Sterling Trust. You stole from your clinically depressed, supposedly mentally unfit daughter to buy designer skis and sip champagne in the mountains. Lydia's face flushed a deep, violent red. She snatched the paper, her manicured nails tearing the edge. "I am your mother!" she shrieked, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "I raised you. I clothed you. I put up with your difficult, miserable attitude for 18 years. I deserve that money for what you put me through. You owed us for the stress of dealing with you." The sheer narcissism of her statement hung in the air. She was actually trying to justify grand larceny as a form of maternal hazard pay. Grant slammed his hands on the table, turning on Lydia. "Are you insane?" he yelled. "You are admitting it right in front of her lawyer. You told me the money was from Dad's corporate bonuses. You told me I was spending clean cash. You set me up. You set me up to look like a criminal in front of Bianca's family." "Do not you dare raise your voice to me, Grant Miller," Lydia screamed back, pointing a shaking finger at her golden child. "We bought you everything. We bought your degrees. We bought your cars. We bought you this pathetic illusion of success because you were too lazy to earn it yourself. You are bleeding us dry with your gambling. And now you have the nerve to blame us." Charles finally snapped. He slammed his fist down, rattling the silverware. "Both of you shut your mouths right now," he roared, completely abandoning his refined country club persona. "Do you not realize what is happening? She is wearing a wire. She is trying to get us to confess." Harrison let out a slow, mocking chuckle. "Charles, we do not need a wire. You documented your own fraud with immaculate accounting precision. The paper trail is flawless. The federal prosecutors are going to use your own spreadsheets to secure your convictions." Bianca stood up abruptly, her chair screeched against the hardwood floor. She looked at Grant as if he were covered in filth. "My father is going to destroy you," she said, her voice shaking with cold fury. "Our lawyers will void the prenuptial agreement negotiations tomorrow morning. I am not marrying a penniless fraud who steals from his own sister." Grant lunged up, grabbing her arm. "Bianca, wait, please. I did not know. I swear to God, I did not know they stole it." She ripped her arm out of his grasp with violent force. She grabbed the massive diamond ring from her left hand, struggled with it for a frantic second, and pulled it off. She threw it directly at Grant's chest. The ring bounced off his designer suit and clattered onto the table, spinning before coming to rest right on top of my grandmother's financial statements. "Keep your stolen garbage," Bianca spat. "Have a nice time in federal prison." She turned on her heel and marched out of the Michelin-starred restaurant, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Grant stood frozen, staring at the discarded ring, watching his entire future, his wealthy safety net, and his manufactured identity walk out the door. He slowly turned his head to look at Charles and Lydia. The golden child was looking at his creators, not with love or gratitude, but with absolute venomous hatred. "You ruined my life," Grant hissed at his parents, tears of pure rage pooling in his eyes. "You told me I was set for life. You ruined everything." I sat back in my chair, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. The dog-eat-dog dynamic was playing out exactly as I had anticipated. The moment the stolen money was exposed, the illusion of their perfect, loving family shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. They were tearing each other apart, and I had not even dropped the final bomb yet. Charles slammed both of his hands onto the table with enough force to rattle the silverware. He completely ignored Grant, turning his entire focus onto me. The veins in his neck were bulging, and his face was a mask of absolute, unhinged corporate arrogance. He was cornered, but men like my father never surrendered. They simply attacked the intellect of anyone who dared to challenge them. "You think you have won?" Charles sneered, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. You sit there with a few printed spreadsheets and a hired suit playing detective. You have absolutely no idea how international financial law actually works. You are an appraiser, Ava. You are a glorified museum clerk. You hold a magnifying glass to dusty oil paintings and memorize trivia about dead artists. You do not possess the cognitive capacity to comprehend the complexity of offshore asset restructuring. He straightened his posture, desperately trying to project the aura of an untouchable financial mastermind. Even if you show those bank statements to a judge, he continued, his tone dripping with patronizing confidence, you cannot prove malicious intent. You cannot prove I committed fraud. I am a senior accounting executive. I placed your trust fund into a series of layered protective holding companies to shield the capital from market volatility. I invested the liquidity into tangible, unregulated assets. It is a perfectly legal wealth preservation strategy. You cannot trace the liquid cash because it does not exist anymore. You are out of your depth, little girl. You have brought a paintbrush to a gunfight. I let his arrogant monologue echo in the quiet space of our dining area. I did not interrupt him. I let him dig his own grave with every single word. I looked at Harrison, who offered me a subtle, knowing nod. Then I turned my attention back to the man who thought he had outsmarted the federal government. I reached down to the floor and picked up my own leather briefcase. I placed it on the table, unzipped the main compartment, and pulled out a thick black binder. I dropped it heavily onto the white linen cloth right next to his stack of bank statements. You are incredibly predictable, Charles, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and razor sharp. You have spent my entire life belittling my intelligence because I did not want to sit in a cubicle and manipulate tax codes. You assumed my career in the fine art sector was just a frivolous hobby. You thought I was just looking at pretty pictures. I opened the black binder. I pulled out a glossy high-end auction catalog from 2 years ago and slid it across the table until it rested against his water glass. Turn to page 42, I commanded. Charles stared at the catalog, refusing to touch it. His arrogant facade faltered for a fraction of a second. I reached over and flipped the page for him, tapping my manicured finger on a high-resolution photograph of a rare 19th-century French bronze sculpture. That piece was purchased at a private estate sale in Geneva 30 months ago, I stated, my voice echoing with forensic precision. The buyer was listed as an anonymous overseas holding company. The purchase price was $400,000. The funds for that transaction originated directly from the Beatrice Sterling Irrevocable Trust. You wired the stolen money to Switzerland to buy that bronze. My father swallowed hard. His eyes locked on the photograph. He tried to maintain his composure, but his breathing had become noticeably shallow. So what? He shot back, his voice losing its forceful edge. I made a tangible asset investment on behalf of the trust. That is not a crime. I pulled a second document from the binder. It was an internal, highly confidential consignment agreement from my employer. I placed it directly on top of the catalog. 6 months after that purchase, I continued relentlessly, that exact same bronze sculpture was consigned to my auction house in Manhattan. The seller was listed as a newly formed Delaware Limited Liability Company. The sculpture sold at our spring auction for $450,000. The proceeds from that sale were wired to a clean state bank account belonging to you, Charles, an account completely disconnected from my grandmother's name. Lydia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she finally began to understand the mechanics of what her husband had been doing. Grant sat frozen in his chair, too stunned by the loss of his fiancée to fully comprehend the legal nightmare unfolding in front of him. I leaned forward, closing the distance between my father and me. I locked eyes with him, making sure he understood the absolute magnitude of his destruction. It is the oldest trick in the billionaire playbook, I said softly, driving the final nail into his coffin. You buy unregulated, high-value art and antiquities with dirty, stolen money. Then you consign those pieces to prestigious, pristine auction houses using anonymous proxy sellers. You let the auction house sell the item to a legitimate buyer, and they wire you clean, fully taxable capital gains. It is a textbook money laundering syndicate, and you ran the entire operation using my inheritance. Charles's face turned the color of ash. He stared at me, sheer terror finally breaking through his arrogant exterior. He opened his mouth to deny it, but his voice failed him. "Did you really think I spent the last decade studying art history?" I asked, my tone laced with absolute unyielding triumph. "Because I liked the brush strokes? Did you really think I clawed my way up to become a senior appraiser at one of the most elite auction houses on the planet just for the prestige? I spent 10 years building an immaculate reputation specifically so I would be granted high-level executive clearance. I needed security access to view the private, confidential consignment records. I became an appraiser specifically to hunt you down. I began pulling page after page from the black binder, tossing them onto the table in a rapid, relentless barrage. Here is the provenance record for the vintage Patek Philippe, watch you bought in London and washed through our autumn sale. Here is the transaction history for the collection of rare diamonds you routed through a proxy buyer in Dubai. Every single time you used a shell company to wash my stolen trust fund money, I flagged the items. I tracked the shipping manifests. I pulled the IP addresses from the anonymous seller accounts and matched them directly to the servers at your corporate accounting firm. I was the insider, Charles. I stood on the auction block and watched you launder my money in real time, and I meticulously documented every single federal violation you committed. My mother let out a strangled, terrified whimper. She turned to my father, grabbing his sleeve. "Tell me she is lying, Charles. Tell me you did not leave a paper trail. If they prove money laundering, they will seize everything. They will take our house." Charles could not look at her. He was staring at the mountain of irrefutable evidence I had just dumped onto the dining table. The man who viewed his family as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet had just been completely dismantled by the daughter he deemed worthless. Harrison Brooks stepped forward, his imposing presence casting a long, dark shadow over my parents. He adjusted his suit jacket, his expression completely devoid of mercy. "As a financial executive," Harrison said, his voice deep and resonant, "you are well aware of the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for federal wire fraud. But combining that with a multi-million-dollar international money laundering operation elevates this to an entirely different judicial stratosphere. You did not just steal from your daughter, Charles. You used the United States banking system and international auction houses to conceal the proceeds of a crime. The evidence Ava has compiled is not just civil litigation material. It is a fully categorized criminal dossier." I sat back in my chair, picking up my glass of sparkling water. I took a slow, victorious sip. "You thought I was a disappointment because I did not understand financial law?" I said, looking at the broken, trembling man across from me. "But I understand it perfectly. I have just used it to build your prison cell instead of a portfolio." Charles stared at the mountain of evidence documenting his money laundering operation, but the absolute arrogance of a man who had spent his entire life dodging consequences refused to let him surrender. He had been backed into a corner, completely stripped of his financial leverage. So he did what every desperate narcissist does when their private crimes are exposed. He threatened public destruction. His breathing slowed. He straightened his tie with trembling fingers and forced a chilling, hollow laugh that echoed sharply over our table. "You really think you have outsmarted me?" Charles sneered, his voice dropping into a menacing, calculated rhythm. "You think a stack of auction records and some banking spreadsheets are going to put me behind bars? You are forgetting one crucial element, Ava. I have spent the last 30 years building an impenetrable fortress of social and professional capital. I sit on the boards of 3 major charities. I golf with media executives and federal judges. You are a 32-year-old single woman with a documented history of being committed to a psychiatric facility. He leaned across the table, his eyes burning with absolute malice. If you try to take this to the authorities, I will unleash a public relations nightmare that will swallow you whole. I will hire the most aggressive crisis management firm in Manhattan. I will feed your fabricated teenage psychiatric evaluations to every tabloid, every blog, and every news outlet in this city. I will spin a narrative so convincing the entire world will believe you are a deeply unstable, greedy, and vindictive daughter trying to extort her loving parents for trust fund money you are too mentally ill to manage. Lydia sat up straighter, her posture immediately reflecting her husband's newly found bravado. "Yes," she chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. "We will destroy your reputation in the press before you even make it to a courtroom. No one will believe a hysterical, ungrateful child over a respected corporate executive. We will paint you as a monster." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity or my character. I simply reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my smartphone. I placed it gently on the white linen tablecloth right next to his catastrophic stack of financial crimes. "You have always possessed a staggering level of hubris, Charles," I said, keeping my tone completely conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than his impending federal indictment. "You genuinely believe your wealth buys you immunity from the truth. You believe you can control the narrative because you pay publicists to clean up your messes, but you have one fatal flaw: your absolute obsession with displaying expensive things." Charles frowned, his eyes darting to my phone. He demanded to know what I was talking about. He ordered me to put the phone away and listen to his terms. I ignored him and tapped the screen, unlocking the device. "Last year, for your 60th birthday, I attended a family dinner much like this one. You spent the entire evening ignoring me, catering to Grant, and boasting about your recent promotion. But I brought you a gift anyway. Do you remember what I gave you?" My father scoffed, crossing his arms defensively. "You gave me a watch. A piece of technology I did not need or ask for." "Not just a watch," I corrected him, maintaining direct, piercing eye contact. "I gave you a limited edition, high-end smartwatch with a platinum case. Its retail price was $35,000. I knew you didn't like the meaning of the gift, since it came from a daughter you despised, but I also knew you really liked the price. I knew you'd never let a $35,000 accessory sit in a drawer. You had to wear it to the country club. You had to flash it during your corporate board meetings. You wore it every single day to prove to your wealthy colleagues that you belonged in their elite circle." A flicker of uncertainty crossed my father's face. His right hand instinctively twitched toward his left wrist where the heavy platinum watch currently sat, secured by a custom leather band. "When I gave you that watch," I continued, my voice smooth and lethal, "I offered to set it up for you. You handed it over gladly because you could not be bothered to learn the operating system. You did not realize that I linked the device directly to a secure, encrypted cloud server that I completely control. You did not realize that the ambient voice memo feature was set to automatically sync every time you connected to your office Wi-Fi. You walked into your most highly classified, deeply corrupt meetings, wearing a live microphone strapped to your own wrist." The color instantly drained from Charles. He stared at his wrist in sheer, unadulterated horror, as if the platinum watch had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. "You bluffed about tearing me down in the media," I said, resting my index finger over the play button on my screen. "You threatened to tell the world I am a liar. Let us see how the media handles this specific narrative. Let us see how your crisis management team spins the exact moment you secured your own spot in a federal penitentiary." I pressed play. I turned the volume up just enough for the audio to carry perfectly across our table and into the adjacent VIP booth where Harrison Brooks stood watching. The recording was crystal clear. There was the sound of a heavy door closing, followed by the clinking of a glass. "Listen to me very carefully, Agent Caldwell." My father's voice filled the air, thick with arrogance and entitlement. The audio playback captured Charles's exact tone. "Let us not pretend this IRS audit is about justice or bureaucratic accuracy. It is about a number. I know the Apex Holdings file is sitting on your desk. I am offering you $300,000 in untraceable offshore cryptocurrency to permanently close that file by Friday. You stamp it clean, you shred the flag reports, and we both walk away significantly wealthier." A second voice, hesitant but greedy, responded on the recording. "If I do this, there cannot be a paper trail. The transfer has to be completely blind. It is already staged." Charles's recorded voice replied smoothly. $300,000. Just make the audit disappear, Caldwell." I tapped the screen, stopping the playback. The ensuing silence at our table was absolute. The background music of the Michelin-starred restaurant seemed to completely vanish. Lydia covered her mouth with both hands, a choked, terrified sob escaping her throat. Grant pushed his chair back, pressing himself against the wall of the booth, as if trying to physically distance himself from the radioactive fallout of his father's crimes. "Tax evasion is a serious felony," Charles said, leaning forward and lowering my voice to a sharp, predatory whisper. "Money laundering will cost you your assets and your freedom. But actively bribing a federal agent of the Internal Revenue Service, that is an entirely different category of destruction. There is no public relations firm on earth that can spin a high-definition audio recording of you committing federal bribery." Harrison Brooks stepped closer to the table, adjusting his immaculate suit jacket. His presence amplified the total devastation I had just unleashed. "Bribery of a federal official carries a maximum sentence of 15 years in federal prison," Harrison stated, his legal authority hammering the final nail into my father's coffin. "That is a consecutive sentence, Charles. It runs in addition to the wire fraud, the bank fraud, and the money laundering charges. You threatened to ruin Ava's reputation in the tabloids. But the only press release being drafted tomorrow morning will be from the Department of Justice, announcing the complete dismantling of your financial career and your immediate arrest." Charles sat completely paralyzed. He looked down at the expensive platinum watch strapped to his wrist. He had voluntarily carried the instrument of his own demise into every corrupt meeting he had attended over the past year. His insatiable greed and desperate need to project wealth had blinded him to the trap I had meticulously laid. "You called me worthless tonight," I said, my voice carrying the triumphant resonance of a woman who had just conquered her greatest abuser. "You said I had outlived my usefulness to this family, but I think I just proved exactly how much value I possess. You wanted to disown me, but I just fired you." The silence that followed the audio recording was heavy and suffocating. Charles was completely immobilized by his own hubris, staring blankly at the platinum watch on his wrist. But the financial slaughter at our table was far from over. I turned my attention away from the broken patriarch and locked my gaze onto the golden child. Grant had spent the last few minutes pressing himself into the leather banquette, hoping the fallout would somehow bypass him. He was a coward who had always relied on our parents to shield him from the consequences of his own incompetence. But the blast radius of this revelation was too massive, and it was about to incinerate his entire fabricated life. Bianca sat rigidly beside him. Her designer clutch rested on her lap, and her manicured hands gripped it so tightly her knuckles were white. Her smartphone suddenly illuminated the dim space of the booth. It vibrated violently against the polished wood of the table. The caller ID flashed the name Montgomery, the senior wealth manager for her family estate. Bianca did not answer the call immediately. She stared at the screen as a rapid succession of text messages began flooding in. The previews illuminated one catastrophic phrase after another. Asset freeze. Fraud investigation. Tribeca property compromised. Emergency meeting required. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and offered Bianca a look of cold, calculating pity. "You should open those messages, Bianca," I said smoothly. "Your family advisors work fast, but they are still a few steps behind the reality of your situation. You thought Grant was just living off a stolen trust fund. That is only half the story. The other half involves what he did with the property your father bought for your wedding gift." Grant lunged toward her phone, his face a mask of absolute panic. "Bianca, do not read that," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "It is a mistake. It is just the lawyers overreacting to the audit. Give me the phone. I can explain everything." Bianca slapped his hand away with a vicious strike. "Do not touch me," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying rage. She unlocked her phone, her eyes darting across the screen as she read the incoming reports from her family attorneys. The color completely drained from her face. Her perfect aristocratic composure shattered into a million jagged pieces of raw shock. She stopped breathing for a solid 5 seconds as the magnitude of the betrayal set in. I decided to narrate the exact details of her digital discovery. I wanted my mother to hear every single word of her golden boy and his absolute failure. 2 weeks ago, I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the restaurant, Grant received a massive margin call on his offshore cryptocurrency accounts. The digital markets tanked overnight, and his highly leveraged positions were instantly liquidated. He owed his brokers $2.8 million in immediate cash. Our parents could not cover it because Charles's assets were already locked in the IRS audit crosshairs. So Grant did what any desperate, parasitic gambler would do. He forged your signature. Bianca, Lydia, let out a sharp, horrified gasp. She grabbed Grant by the arm, digging her nails into his expensive suit jacket. "Grant, what did you do?" she demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not ruin this." Grant could not look at our mother. He stared at his designer shoes, his entire body shaking as the walls closed in around him. "He used a predatory shadow lender," I continued relentlessly, ensuring the entire table absorbed the full weight of his betrayal. "He secretly mortgaged the Tribeca townhouse, the $6 million property your father purchased entirely in cash as your bridal gift. Grant leveraged the deed to secure a high-interest loan to cover his crypto losses. He bet your future marital home on a digital coin, and he lost every single penny. The shadow lender just filed a lien against the property this morning. Your father's wealth manager just found the public filing." Bianca's chest heaved. She looked up from her phone, staring at the man she was supposed to marry in less than 6 months. The man who had charmed her wealthy parents, who had promised to protect her, who had paraded around New York high society as a brilliant tech entrepreneur. "You mortgaged my house," Bianca whispered, her voice eerily quiet, stripped of all emotion. "You forged my signature and put a lien on the property my father bought for me." Grant scrambled out of the booth, dropping to his knees right there on the floor of the Michelin-starred dining room. He grabbed Bianca's hands, tears streaming down his face. "It was a temporary liquidity issue," he begged, completely abandoning his pride and dignity in front of the entire restaurant. "I had a tip on a new coin. It was supposed to triple in value. I was going to pay the loan back before the wedding. I was going to double the money and surprise you. You have to believe me, Bianca. I love you. We can fix this. Dad can fix this." He turned his desperate, tear-stained face toward Charles. "Dad, do something. Call the brokers. Tell them you will cover the lien. We can move money from the firm." Charles stared blankly ahead, completely broken by across Grant's face. The sharp crack of the impact echoed through the entire dining room, silencing the nearby tables. Grant fell backward, clutching his reddened cheeks, stunned into absolute silence. Bianca did not even look at him again. Bianca turned her furious gaze toward Lydia, who was sitting frozen in the booth, watching her perfect, carefully constructed world burn to ash. Bianca reached down and grabbed her left hand. She gripped the massive $250,000 diamond engagement ring that had been purchased with my stolen inheritance. She ripped it off her finger with such force it left a bright red mark on her skin. She drew her arm back and threw the heavy diamond ring directly at my mother's face. The sharp metal struck Lydia square on the cheekbone before clattering onto the white linen tablecloth right next to the empty wine glasses. Lydia cried out in shock, bringing a trembling hand to her bruised face. "You are all completely repulsive," Bianca said, her voice radiating absolute aristocratic disgust. "You bred a thief, a liar, and a pathetic degenerate." She picked up her designer clutch and looked my mother dead in the eye, delivering a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Keep your useless son." Bianca delivered the final blow, her words laced with total finality. "He is exactly what you deserve." Bianca turned on her heel and marched out of the dining room without looking back. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor, sounding like the final ticking seconds of a time bomb. Grant remained on the floor, staring at the discarded diamond ring sitting on the table. The golden child, the boy who had been handed the world on a silver platter, had just lost his bride, his home, his reputation, and his future in the span of 5 minutes. He had absolutely nothing left, and he had done it all to himself. I looked at Lydia. My mother was clutching her bruised cheek, staring at the empty space where her wealthy future daughter-in-law had just stood. The ultimate socialite had just been publicly humiliated and discarded by the very elite circle she worshipped. Her entire identity was tied to Grant's success. And now he was a bankrupt, publicly disgraced fraud. I picked up my sparkling water, took a slow, refreshing sip, and enjoyed the spectacular view of their absolute ruin. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung shut behind Bianca. The sound echoed with a finality that made my mother physically flinch. Lydia stared at the empty space where her golden ticket to New York high society had just evaporated. The $250,000 diamond ring sat abandoned on the white linen tablecloth, mocking the ruins of her grand design. Grant remained crumpled on the floor, a pathetic heap of designer fabric and shattered entitlement. He buried his face in his hands, releasing a series of loud, humiliating sobs that drew disgusted glances from the surrounding tables. The golden child was experiencing his very first consequence, and it was entirely paralyzing. Lydia slowly turned her head toward me. The violent rage that had possessed her just moments ago vanished completely. In its place, she summoned the most spectacular performance of her entire life. Her lower lip began to tremble. Large, perfect tears welled up in her eyes and cascaded down her cheeks, carefully avoiding her expensive mascara. She pressed her hands to her chest, adopting the posture of a fragile, heartbroken woman who had just been subjected to a terrible, unpredictable tragedy. "Ava, my mother," she whimpered, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "Ava, please, we have to stop this immediately. This has gone entirely too far. Look at what is happening to our family. Look at your poor brother on the floor. He is completely devastated. We cannot let money destroy everything we have built together." I did not move a single muscle. I watched her weaponize her tears, fascinated by the sheer elasticity of her conscience. Just 10 minutes ago, she was demanding I go to federal prison to protect her lifestyle. She had threatened to destroy my immaculate reputation in the art world. Now she was pleading for my sympathy. Lydia slid across the leather banquette, reaching her hand out across the table as if trying to physically bridge the massive chasm she had spent 3 decades digging. She ignored the mountain of financial evidence separating us. She ignored the irrefutable proof of her own grand larceny. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding," Lydia sobbed, letting a tear fall onto the pristine tablecloth. "You have to understand the immense pressure we were under. Your father gets so stressed about the corporate accounts and the market fluctuations. He makes decisions without consulting me. I never wanted to take your grandmother's money, Ava. I swear to you. I told him it was wrong. But you know how Charles is when he focuses on wealth preservation. He insisted he was just growing the portfolio for your future. We were keeping it safe for you until you were truly ready to manage it." She was throwing her husband directly under the bus to save her own skin. Charles, still paralyzed by the reality of the audio recording that captured his federal bribery, barely registered his wife's betrayal. He just stared blankly ahead, completely detached from the ongoing wreckage of his life. Lydia continued her frantic, desperate rewriting of history. "I love you, Ava. You are my daughter. You have always been my brilliant, independent, and capable girl. I pushed you hard because I knew you had so much incredible potential. I was hard on you because the world is hard on women, and I needed you to be strong enough to survive it. Everything I did, every strict rule, every high expectation, it was all born from a mother's deep, profound love. We share the same blood. Blood is thicker than water. Ava, you cannot let these lawyers and these horrible documents tear our family apart. We can fix this mess privately. We can pay the taxes together. We can go to family counseling. Just tell Mr. Brooks to destroy that file, and we can start completely over." I looked at her outstretched hand. It was trembling, adorned with a platinum tennis bracelet bought directly with the proceeds of my stolen trust fund. She was begging me to remember our blood ties while actively wearing the spoils of her theft. My mother was deploying the classic narcissistic pivot. When intimidation fails, play the ultimate victim. When the evidence is undeniable, claim good intentions and manipulate the emotional bond. She was attempting to gaslight me into believing that decades of emotional abuse, financial extortion, and systematic exclusion were actually just misguided acts of maternal devotion. She genuinely believed that a few strategic tears could erase the reality of her own monstrous behavior. I picked up my phone from the table. The screen was still brightly illuminated. The voice memo application was prominently displayed, the digital waves fluctuating with every word spoken in the room. I looked my mother directly in the eyes. I stripped every ounce of emotion from my face, presenting her with a mirror of absolute, unyielding coldness. "You are a phenomenal actress, Lydia," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of empathy. "If I were still the desperate, anxious teenager you locked in a psychiatric ward for crying over my grandmother's passing, I might actually believe you. I might reach across this table, take your hand, and apologize for making you upset. I might sign that fraudulent liability waiver just to make your tears stop and earn a fraction of your approval." Lydia's eyes widened with a desperate, frantic hope. She leaned closer, thinking her manipulation was finally gaining traction. "Yes, Ava," she whispered eagerly. "Yes, you understand me. We just need to put this ugly business behind us and heal." I shattered her hope with brutal precision. "But I am not that girl anymore," I stated flatly. "I am a woman who evaluates authenticity for a living, and your performance is the most glaringly obvious counterfeit in this entire restaurant. You did not push me to be strong, you punished me for existing outside of your shallow, materialistic parameters. You did not hide my inheritance to protect it. You stole it to fund your luxury ski trips and buy your son a superficial identity. You do not love me, Lydia. You love the lifestyle my money provided you." Lydia pulled her hand back, as if she had been burned by an open flame. Her face contorted, the mask of the loving mother slipping to reveal the venomous reality beneath. "Ava, How can you speak to the woman who gave you life this way? Have you no heart at all? I tapped the screen of my smartphone, gesturing to the glowing red recording icon that was still actively registering every single sound at our table. You seem to have forgotten the opening act of this dinner, Mother, I replied, my voice echoing with total finality. You made your position on my existence incredibly clear before the appetizers even arrived. You cannot appeal to my familial loyalty when you spent the last hour explicitly detailing how you plan to ruin my career. You cannot beg for mercy based on our blood connection. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us, ensuring she heard every syllable of her own destruction. I am just a tax break tool, I said, repeating her exact vicious words from earlier. I am just a financial shield who has outlived her usefulness. I am completely worthless to you. That is the truth you firmly believed when you walked into this restaurant tonight. Do not try to rewrite the script now just because the audience has changed. And by the way, the voice recorder is still running. You just gave the federal prosecutors a flawless, high-definition audio confession of your entire extortion attempt. Lydia stared at the glowing red circle on my phone screen. The realization of her monumental failure finally crashed over her. She had not only failed to gaslight me into submission, but had actively provided the federal authorities with a dramatic, legally binding record of her trying to coerce a key witness. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat seized. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp and shrank back into the leather booth, her entire body shaking with the chilling recognition that she was completely and utterly trapped. Charles snapped out of his catatonic state with a sudden, violent jerk. The self-preservation instincts of a cornered white-collar criminal finally overrode his sheer shock. He looked at the glowing red recording icon on my smartphone, then at the massive binder of financial evidence resting on the table. The illusion of his absolute control had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the raw, unfiltered panic of a man staring directly at a lengthy federal prison sentence. He abruptly pushed himself away from the table, the heavy mahogany chair scraping loudly against the polished floor, the harsh sound drawing the attention of the dining room staff. Charles did not care about social decorum anymore. He reached for his expensive Italian leather briefcase, his hands trembling so violently he could barely grip the handle. He snatched his cashmere overcoat from the back of the chair, his breathing ragged and uneven. "I am leaving," Charles announced, his voice a frantic, breathy rasp that lacked any of its usual corporate authority. "I am not sitting here and participating in this fabricated circus. I am calling my legal team. I am calling the managing partners at my firm. We will see how confident you are when my attorneys file a defamation lawsuit against you by morning." He turned on his heel, intending to march out of the restaurant and disappear into the Manhattan night to begin a desperate campaign of damage control. He took exactly one step. Harrison Brooks shifted his imposing frame smoothly, stepping directly into my father's path. Harrison did not raise his hands. He did not adopt a physically aggressive stance. He simply stood there, a movable wall of bespoke tailoring and lethal legal authority, completely blocking the exit from our dining booth. "Sit back down," Harrison commanded. The volume of his voice was remarkably low, yet it carried the undeniable force of a judge delivering a final verdict. "You are not going anywhere, and you are certainly not calling your legal team. Move out of my way, Brooks." Charles snarled, trying to project a menace he no longer possessed. "You have no legal authority to detain me in a public restaurant. This is false imprisonment. I will have you disbarred. Move now, or I will call the police myself." "I highly recommend you do not involve local law enforcement," Harrison replied, offering a cold, razor-sharp smile, "because they will simply hand you over to the federal agents who are already en route. But please, Charles, humor me. Pull out your phone. Call your expensive corporate defense attorneys. Call your wealth managers. In fact, why don't you log into your banking application right now and check your balances? Charles froze. The absolute certainty in Harrison's tone pierced through his frantic desire to escape. He looked at the seasoned trust fund lawyer, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of suspicion and deep, primal dread. "What are you talking about?" Charles demanded, his voice dropping to a frightened whisper. Harrison reached into the interior pocket of his charcoal gray suit jacket. He withdrew a single, crisp sheet of legal paper bearing the unmistakable embossed seal of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. He held it up, perfectly positioned for Charles to read the bold black text at the top of the page. "This is a federal injunction," Harrison stated with immaculate, punishing precision. Specifically, it is an ex parte asset freeze order signed directly by a federal judge exactly 90 minutes ago. It was executed under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, combined with emergency provisions for international money laundering and wire fraud. My father's face turned the color of wet ash. He stared at the federal seal as if it were a physical weapon aimed directly at his chest. "Do you understand what an ex parte freeze means in this context?" Harrison continued relentlessly, ensuring every single syllable inflicted maximum psychological damage. "It means the federal court reviewed the dossier Ava compiled. They listened to the audio recording of your bribery attempt, and they found the evidence of your financial crimes so overwhelming and your flight risk so extraordinarily high that they bypassed a preliminary hearing entirely. They approved the total seizure of your assets before you even ordered your main course tonight." Charles staggered backward, his knees hitting the edge of his leather dining chair. He collapsed into it, the Italian leather briefcase slipping from his trembling fingers and hitting the floor with a dull, heavy thud. "Everything is gone," Harrison said, leaning slightly over the table to deliver the fatal blow. "Every single domestic bank account tied to your name, your social security number, and your firm has been locked by the Department of Justice. The accounts at Chase, the investment portfolios at Goldman Sachs, your joint checking accounts with Lydia, they currently hold a balance of 0. Your credit cards have been globally deactivated. Furthermore, the authorities have already dispatched requests to their international regulatory counterparts. Your shell companies in Delaware are frozen. Your routing numbers in the Cayman Islands are flagged." Lydia let out a high-pitched, suffocating gasp. She clutched her diamond necklace, her eyes darting wildly around the restaurant as if expecting federal agents to drop from the crystal chandeliers. "Frozen?" she repeated, her voice bordering on complete hysteria. "What do you mean frozen? We have bills. We have auto payments. We have the mortgage on the estate. You have absolutely nothing." Lydia Harrison corrected her without a shred of pity. "Your husband utilized a vast network of illicit funds to sustain your lavish lifestyle. Now that the network has been identified as a criminal enterprise, the federal government has seized the infrastructure. You are at this exact second completely destitute." Charles pulled his smartphone from his pocket. His hand shook so violently he dropped it twice before managing to unlock the screen. He opened his primary banking application. I watched his eyes scan the digital interface. I watched the final remnants of his arrogant, untouchable ego shatter into absolute ruin. The screen displayed a bold red error message indicating that the accounts were restricted and required immediate contact with the fraud department. He tried another banking app, then another. He checked his premium black credit card account. Every single digital gateway returned the exact same catastrophic result. Access denied. Account suspended. "You cannot do this," Charles whispered to the screen of his phone, his voice completely hollowed out. "I am a senior executive. I have a fiduciary duty to my clients. You cannot just erase 30 years of capital in 1 hour." "I did not erase it, Charles," I interjected, my voice cutting through his pathetic murmurs of denial. "I simply redirected it to its rightful owner. I spent years tracing the labyrinth of accounts you built to hide my grandmother's money. I mapped the entire architecture of your fraud. When Harrison took that map to the federal judge, it was not just an allegation. It was a fully realized schematic of a criminal syndicate. You built the cage. I just handed the government the padlock. I picked up the leather check holder that the waiter had discreetly dropped off earlier in the evening. I opened it, glancing at the astronomical total for the vintage champagne and the imported caviar my parents had ordered to celebrate my financial execution. I slid the leather folder across the table until it rested directly in front of my father. "You came here tonight to force me into bankruptcy," I said smoothly. "You intended to make me pay for this Michelin-starred dinner as a final insult before you ruined my life. But your credit cards are currently invalid pieces of plastic. You do not have the liquidity to afford a subway ride back to your heavily mortgaged estate, let alone a $3,000 dinner bill." Charles stared at the leather folder. The man who had spent his entire existence obsessing over wealth, status, and financial dominance was now trapped in a luxury restaurant without the means to pay for his own extortion attempt. He looked at me, completely stripped of his power, his pride, and his future. The inescapable perimeter I had meticulously designed had finally and irrevocably snapped shut around him. Charles stared at the leather folder containing the astronomical dinner bill. His chest rose and fell in jagged, uneven breaths. For a man whose entire identity was constructed upon the flawless execution of financial dominance, being rendered entirely insolvent in the middle of a Michelin-starred restaurant was a psychological short-circuit. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to hurl another empty threat, but the words died in his throat. He had no leverage left to pull. The heavy glass doors at the front entrance of the restaurant swung open. There were no flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the Manhattan pavement outside. There were no wailing sirens piercing the crisp evening air. The federal government does not need theatrical displays to announce its absolute authority. It relies on the chilling, inescapable quiet of inevitable consequence. 4 individuals stepped into the ambient light of the dining room. They wore impeccably tailored, unremarkable dark suits. They did not sprint. They did not shout orders or brandish weapons. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that instantly altered the atmospheric pressure of the room. The maitre d' moved to intercept them, offering his standard polished greeting, but the lead individual simply reached into his breast pocket and flashed a subtle metallic glint. The maitre d' immediately stepped back, his posture rigid, gesturing silently toward our table. I watched them navigate the maze of crystal chandeliers and velvet booths. The wealthy patrons around us, titans of industry and socialites accustomed to absolute privacy, sensed the drastic shift in the air. Conversations abruptly died. Silver forks were lowered onto fine china. A heavy, suffocating silence swept across the dining floor as the 4 figures approached our booth in a flawless tactical formation. Harrison Brooks smoothly took a single step to his right, clearing the direct path to my father. Harrison adjusted his immaculate gray suit, his expression a mask of professional satisfaction. He had delivered the preamble. The executioners had arrived to finish the job. The lead agent, a tall woman with sharp features and a gaze completely devoid of mercy, stopped exactly 2 feet from where Charles sat, paralyzed in the leather banquet. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her tone was flat, clinical, and utterly devastating. "Charles Miller," she stated. It was not a question. It was a firm confirmation of target acquisition. My father looked up from the unpaid dinner bill. His face was a ghastly, translucent white, slick with cold sweat. The deeply ingrained arrogance of a corporate executive tried to forcefully override his sheer terror. He attempted to straighten his posture, desperately clinging to the illusion of his social status. "I am Charles Miller," he replied, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound commanding. I am the chief accounting officer of a major financial firm. I am in the middle of a private family dinner. Who are you, and how dare you interrupt us? I will have the management throw you out onto the street." The woman did not blink. She reached into her suit jacket and produced a leather credential case, flipping it open with a sharp, practiced flick of her wrist. The polished gold shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation caught the light from the chandelier above us. The agent standing immediately to her left produced an identical case, revealing the silver badge of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. "I am Special Agent Collins," the lead agent said, completely unfazed by his pathetic attempt at pulling rank. "We are executing a federal arrest warrant issued by the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. You are being taken into custody on multiple federal charges, including wire fraud, bank fraud, international money laundering, and the active bribery of a federal official." Lydia let out a piercing, high-pitched scream. She pressed herself so far back into the corner of the booth, she nearly knocked over a heavy floral arrangement. Grant remained frozen on the floor where his wealthy fiancée had discarded him, his eyes wide and completely vacant, watching his father's untouchable empire crumble into absolute dust. "This is a mistake," Charles stammered, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles cracked. "You have the wrong man. I have a team of corporate defense attorneys. You cannot arrest me in a place like this. Do you have any idea who I am? I manage portfolios for the elite. I demand to make a phone call immediately." Agent Collins simply nodded to the two agents flanking her. "Please stand up, Mr. Miller. Keep your hands visible and place them behind your back." Charles refused to move. He gripped the table, shaking his head rapidly. "No, I am not going anywhere with you. I am not a criminal. I am a wealth manager. This is my daughter's fault. She fabricated these allegations because she is mentally unstable. She stole my smartwatch and altered the recordings. She is the one you should be putting in handcuffs." The federal agents did not entertain his frantic, delusional bargaining. The two male agents stepped forward in unison. They reached down, grabbed Charles by his tailored sleeves, and forcibly hauled him out of the plush leather booth. He stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished marble floor. "Do not touch me," Charles yelled, his voice cracking into a humiliating, desperate squeak. "Lydia, call the firm. Call the senior partners. Tell them I am being unlawfully detained. Tell them to dispatch the legal team immediately." Lydia remained frozen, weeping uncontrollably into her hands, utterly devastated by the abrupt and violent collapse of her high society standing. Grant stared, unseeing, at the gleaming shoes of the federal agents, his reality utterly annihilated. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs reverberated through the hushed restaurant. It was a sound both brutal and starkly real. The agents expertly twisted Charles's arms behind him, securing his wrists in the cold metal. The man who had spent his life reducing individuals to mere tax deductions and financial liabilities was now bound like a common criminal. Agent Collins approached, meeting my father's gaze as he struggled futilely against the tight restraints. "Charles Miller, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The utter perfection of the irony in that last sentence was profound. Thanks to the asset freeze Harrison had orchestrated, Charles literally could not afford an attorney. The man who managed billions in elite portfolios was about to require a court-appointed public defender. I sat at the table, impeccably composed, observing the entire spectacle with a chilling sense of satisfaction. Charles twisted his head, fixing me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. His face was slick with sweat, his expensive suit rumpled and disheveled by the physical arrest. "You did this," he spat, his voice a venomous hiss. "You ungrateful, malicious failure. I gave you life. I should have left you in that psychiatric ward. I will make you pay for this." I lifted my crystal water glass and took a slow, measured sip. My voice remained level. I didn't need to raise it. The entire dining room was silent, hanging on my every word. "You gave me a social security number to commit tax fraud, Charles," I replied smoothly. "You kept me around for the tax breaks. You literally sat at this table and said, I had outlived my usefulness to this family. I simply proved you wrong. I was incredibly useful tonight. I just helped the federal government balance their books." Agent Collins firmly grasped Charles by the bicep, turning him away from the table. "Let us go, Mr. Miller. Your evening is over." They marched him through the center of the Michelin-starred dining room. Every wealthy patron, every socialite, every corporate titan at the surrounding tables watched the chief accounting officer of a major financial firm being paraded out in federal handcuffs. There were no hushed whispers of sympathy, only the cold, judgmental silence of the elite, observing one of their own being violently expelled from their ranks. The public humiliation was absolute, devastating, and irreversible. Agent Collins gave the signal. The two male federal agents adjusted their grip on Charles, preparing to guide him through the gauntlet of elite diners. My father, a man who had spent 3 decades meticulously crafting an image of untouchable financial supremacy, was now forced to walk with his head bowed, his wrists bound in heavy steel. The bespoke suit hung awkwardly over the rigid angles of the handcuffs. He took one hesitant step forward, his expensive leather shoes dragging heavily across the polished marble floor. Before they could take another step towards the exit, I pushed my chair back. The scrape of its wooden legs against the floor was piercing in the dead silence of the dining room. I stood up, unhurried. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored jacket and looked down at the table. There, resting beside my crystal water goblet, was the thick manila folder. It contained the Declaration of Disownment, the financial death warrant my parents had brought to my 32nd birthday dinner with the sole intention of destroying my life. Perfectly placed on top was the heavy, gold-plated pen Charles had ordered me to use just an hour prior. I picked up the pen. Its metal felt cool and substantial in my fingers. I then picked up the folder. I walked slowly around the edge of the plush leather banquette. Harrison Brooks stepped aside with a polite nod, clearing a path for me. The federal agents paused their march. Agent Collins looked at me, her sharp eyes assessing my intent, but she did not intervene. She recognized the profound finality of what was about to occur. I stopped exactly 1 foot away from my father. Charles was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow bursts of sheer panic. He refused to meet my gaze, staring fixedly at the floor, utterly broken by the sheer weight of his public humiliation. The tables around us were filled with the very people he worshipped and feared: hedge fund managers, corporate board members, and real estate tycoons, all watching him fall from grace in real time. "Look at me, Charles," I commanded. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried a dense, lethal gravity that forced his head to snap up immediately. His eyes were bloodshot and utterly hollow. The arrogant patriarch was gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered criminal who had run out of lies. I held up the manila folder so he could clearly see the bold black text printed across the top page. I clicked the gold-plated pen, the sharp mechanical sound echoing between us. I placed the document flat against the polished wooden surface of an empty serving cart positioned next to our table. I deliberately separated the first page, the one explicitly declaring our complete severance as a family unit, from the pages beneath it that attempted to transfer his toxic tax debt. I uncapped the pen and pressed the ink to the thick, premium paper. I signed my full legal name on the dotted line, pressing down hard to ensure the signature was immaculate, undeniable, and entirely permanent. I then picked up the signed document, leaving the rest of the worthless folder abandoned on the cart. I folded the heavy paper precisely in half. I stepped directly into my father's personal space. He flinched instinctively, trying to pull back, but the agents held him firmly in place, allowing no retreat. I reached out and shoved the folded document deep into the breast pocket of his ruined suit jacket. I patted the pocket flat, my hand resting briefly over his rapidly beating heart. "You brought this to my birthday dinner to erase me," I said, keeping my voice low, ensuring the words belonged solely to us and the federal agents holding him captive. "You thought you could trick me into signing away my life to cover your monumental failures. You told me I was a disappointment. You told me I was nothing but a tax break." Charles squeezed his eyes shut. A single bead of cold sweat rolled down his temple. He couldn't formulate a single word of defense. His breathing hitched as the reality of his total defeat washed over him. "While I signed it," I stated, my tone radiating absolute merciless victory, "the disownment is official. The $2 million tax evasion debt from your fraudulent shell company is entirely yours. The international money laundering charges are yours. The federal prison sentence waiting for you at the end of this night is yours. You will bear every single ounce of this destruction completely alone." I took a deliberate step backward, severing the physical and emotional proximity between us forever. "We are no longer family," I declared, sealing his fate with absolute precision. "You are merely a criminal the federal government helped apprehend." Agent Collins offered a silent nod of professional acknowledgement before turning her attention back to her high-value target. "Let's move," she ordered her team. The agents guided Charles forward, marching him directly through the restaurant's main aisle. There was no discreet back exit, no effort to spare his dignity. He was paraded past every table, under the unblinking scrutiny of the Manhattan elite. Whispers immediately began, a rising tide of judgment and scandal poised to dominate the financial news cycle by dawn. The heavy glass doors swung open, admitting a gust of cold night air as Charles was swallowed by the darkness outside, officially entering the custody of the United States justice system. I turned my back on the exit and surveyed the remnants of my former family remaining at our table. Lydia was slumped over, her face buried in her arms, her meticulously styled hair askew. The diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist glinted, a stark reminder of the stolen inheritance she would soon be forced to surrender to the authorities. Her sobs, loud and ragged, echoed the absolute death of her country club existence. Without Charles's income, without my pilfered trust fund, and with her assets completely frozen by the federal court, she was now utterly destitute. Grant was still on the floor. He had pulled his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around them like a terrified child, staring blankly at the empty chair where his wealthy fiancée had sat just 20 minutes prior. The golden boy had lost his bride, his luxury vehicles, his offshore accounts, and the father who had shielded him from reality. At 29 years old, he possessed zero life skills, a staggering gambling debt, and no one left to bail him out. They were pathetically broken. I felt no pity. I felt no guilt. I felt only the pure, unadulterated sensation of a massive, suffocating weight being permanently lifted from my shoulders. The decades of emotional manipulation, the constant comparisons, the brutal insults about my career choices, it was all utterly extinguished. They had tried to bury me, but they had only succeeded in handing me the shovel to dig their own graves. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant had barely sealed shut behind my father when the remaining tension at our table snapped violently. The reality of the situation crashed down upon my brother with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. The golden child, who had never faced a single consequence in his entire 29 years, suddenly grasped that his bottomless bank account had just been seized by the federal government. He understood that his shipping heiress fiancée was never coming back. He understood that the luxurious, consequence-free life our parents had curated for him was permanently terminated. Grant pushed himself up from the polished marble floor. His designer suit was wrinkled and stained with spilled water. His face, usually set in a mask of unwarranted arrogance, contorted into a grotesque display of misdirected feral rage. He couldn't blame his father for federal tax fraud. He couldn't blame his mother for her insatiable greed. He could only blame the woman who had refused to be their sacrificial lamb. "You ruined my life!" Grant screamed, his voice cracking harshly against the crystal chandeliers and mahogany walls of the dining room. "You took my money. You took Bianca. I am going to kill you." He lacked the tactical intelligence to realize how utterly outnumbered he was, blinded by the pathetic entitlement of a man who believed the world owed him everything. Grant lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight across the white linen tablecloth. His hands swiped through the expensive stemware, sending crystal champagne flutes and water goblets shattering onto the floor, shards of glass exploding in every direction. He reached for my throat, his eyes wide and utterly unhinged. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply stood my ground, watching his pathetic attempt at physical intimidation unfold exactly as a predictable coward would execute it. Harrison Brooks shifted his stance, preparing to intercept the attack, but his physical intervention proved entirely unnecessary. The Michelin-starred restaurant catered to international diplomats, hedge fund billionaires, and high-profile celebrities. Their private security detail was exceptionally trained, highly aggressive, and instantly responsive. Before Grant could even clear the width of the dining table, two massive men in tailored black suits materialized from the shadows of the adjacent corridor. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. The first security officer grabbed Grant by the collar of his suit jacket and forcefully yanked him backward, completely halting his forward momentum. The second officer seized my brother by the belt and shoulder, utilizing his own chaotic energy against him. With a swift, brutal motion, the security team slammed Grant directly into the solid marble floor. The impact was loud and punishing. The air was violently expelled from my brother's lungs in a ragged gasp. One of the officers immediately drove his knee directly into the center of Grant's back, pinning him immovably to the ground. He grabbed both of Grant's wrists, pulling them sharply upward and securing them tightly with a thick, heavy-duty nylon zip tie. "Get off me!" Grant shrieked, his voice muffled against the cold stone floor. "Do you know who my father is? Do you know who I am? Let me go." "You are currently detained for attempted assault and destruction of private property," the security officer stated in a flat, mechanical tone. "Remain entirely still, or I will escalate the physical restraint." A uniformed police officer, who had remained stationed near the entrance to assist the federal agents with perimeter control during my father's arrest, casually strolled over to our table. He looked down at Grant thrashing helplessly on the floor, then nodded at the private security team, silently confirming that the situation was entirely under their legal jurisdiction. Lydia witnessed her precious golden boy being physically subdued and treated like a common street thug. The sight of Grant's face pressed against the shattered glass and spilled wine completely shattered her remaining sanity. She realized screaming had failed. She realized emotional manipulation and gaslighting had spectacularly failed. She was trapped in a room full of Manhattan elites watching her family disintegrate with cold, judgmental fascination. So, my mother resorted to the absolute last, most desperate weapon in her arsenal of narcissistic manipulation. She decided to stage a catastrophic medical emergency. Lydia let out a theatrical, piercing gasp that sounded perfectly rehearsed. She clutched her chest with both hands, her eyes rolling back into her head with dramatic exaggeration. She swayed dramatically on her feet, emitting a loud, shuddering moan before allowing her knees to buckle. She collapsed backward, ensuring she landed safely against the plush leather banquette before sliding gracefully to the floor. Lydia lay perfectly still, eyes squeezed shut, awaiting the inevitable rush of sympathy. She expected wealthy patrons to drop their silverware and sprint to her aid. She anticipated someone, anyone, screaming for a doctor and offering the attention and victimhood she so desperately craved. Silence. The dining room remained deafeningly still. Billionaires, socialites, and corporate titans at the surrounding tables didn't even flinch. They simply stared, a mixture of profound disgust and clinical amusement evident. They recognized a fraudulent performance the moment they saw it. These were people who orchestrated hostile corporate takeovers and survived vicious public scandals. They were utterly immune to the cheap, pathetic theatrics of a disgraced suburban housewife. The maitre d' approached, his face an impenetrable mask of customer service protocol. He didn't kneel beside her, nor did he offer water. He calmly pulled a small radio from his belt and requested emergency medical services for a patron experiencing an unspecified episode. His action was not out of concern, but entirely to protect the restaurant from frivolous liability lawsuits. Lydia remained on the floor, her chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, perfectly healthy pattern. She peeked through her eyelashes, a mounting horror dawning as her performance spectacularly bombed. There was no audience sympathy, only the cold, harsh glare of absolute social ruin. Within 4 minutes, 2 paramedics from a nearby emergency response unit entered the restaurant, carrying heavy medical bags and moving with practiced efficiency. They knelt beside my mother, snapping on blue nitrile gloves. Lydia immediately amplified her act, emitting weak, breathy groans and fluttering her eyelids as if fighting to maintain consciousness. The lead paramedic ignored her dramatic groans. He swiftly wrapped a blood pressure cuff around her arm and clipped a pulse oximeter to her index finger. He shone a bright penlight directly into her eyes. Lydia winced tightly, shutting her eyes against the glare. The paramedic glanced at the digital readout on his monitor, then at his partner. He let out a heavy, distinctly irritated sigh. "Ma'am," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire dining section to hear. "Your resting heart rate is a perfectly normal 72 beats per minute. Your blood pressure is 120/80. Your oxygen saturation is at 100%. Your pupillary response is sharp and voluntary. You are not experiencing a cardiac event. You are not experiencing a neurological deficit. You are experiencing a temper tantrum. I suggest you stand up before the police officer behind you decides to cite you for the misuse of emergency medical services." A ripple of low, mocking laughter spread across the adjacent tables. The ultimate high society humiliation was complete. Lydia had tried to fake a life-threatening emergency and had been clinically, publicly exposed as an absolute fraud by a city paramedic. Lydia opened her eyes. The fake tears were gone, replaced by sheer, unadulterated mortification. She slowly pushed herself up from the floor, her designer dress wrinkled, her perfect hair disheveled. She looked at the smirking faces of the wealthy patrons. She looked at Grant, who was now being pulled to his feet by the security officers, his hands securely bound by heavy plastic zip ties. I took one final step toward the two of them. I looked down at the physical manifestations of my lifelong abusers. Stripped of their wealth, their power, their social standing, and their dignity, they had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. "You cannot manipulate a heart monitor, Lydia," I said smoothly, my voice ringing with total, unshakable victory. "Just like you cannot manipulate a federal tax audit. You spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was the failure of this family. You tried to make me feel small so you could feel powerful. But the truth is, finally out. You are just a pair of pathetic, desperate thieves who got caught." I turned my back on them. I did not wait to hear their response. I did not care if they screamed or cried or begged. They were completely irrelevant to my future. I walked toward the exit, leaving my mother standing in the ruins of her fake medical emergency and my brother waiting to be handed over to the local precinct. The heavy chains they had wrapped around my life for 32 years were finally, permanently shattered. I did not look back. The fundamental rule of surviving a catastrophic explosion is to maintain a forward trajectory while the shockwave decimates the entire landscape behind you. I walked past the remaining tables of the Michelin-starred restaurant with immaculate posture. My gaze locked firmly on the heavy glass doors at the front entrance. The shocked whispers of the Manhattan elite faded into a dull, insignificant hum. I could hear the faint, pathetic sounds of Grant arguing with the private security team, and Lydia attempting to salvage her shattered dignity with the arriving local police officers. But their frantic voices belonged to a past life I had officially and permanently terminated. The maitre d', who had just witnessed my entire family implode over the course of a single hour, rushed forward to hold the brass handles of the door open for me. He did not offer a customary pleasantry or a polite farewell. He offered a deep, highly respectful nod, a silent, professional acknowledgement of the absolute, brutal shift in power he had just watched me execute. I stepped through the threshold, my designer heels clicking sharply against the marble, and walked out into the biting chill of the city. The New York night air was sharp and violently cold, slicing right through the thin fabric of my tailored suit jacket. Yet, for the first time in 32 years, I felt a profound radiating warmth spreading through the center of my chest. The suffocating weight of my parents' expectations, the endless financial anxiety, the psychological cage they had meticulously built around my existence to keep me compliant, it was all completely incinerated. The city streets were alive with the steady, aggressive rhythm of late-night traffic and the distant wail of emergency sirens. It was a stark, brilliant contrast to the suffocating, artificial silence of the dining room I had just left. I stood on the pavement, pulling the crisp, freezing air deep into my lungs. A sleek, armored black Maybach idled smoothly at the curb, its high-performance engine purring with quiet, expensive power. Harrison Brooks stepped out from the shadows of the restaurant awning. He moved with the effortless, predatory grace of a man who had just successfully executed a flawless legal assassination. He did not offer empty platitudes or emotional congratulations. Harrison reached for the heavy silver handle of the rear passenger door, pulling it open with a smooth, practiced motion. He gestured for me to step inside the climate-controlled interior of the luxury vehicle. Before I entered, he reached into the interior breast pocket of his charcoal gray overcoat. He withdrew a thick, leather-bound folio embossed with the gold crest of his elite law firm and held it out to me. The ambient light from the street lamps caught the metallic gleam of the heavy binder rings. "This is the fully ratified documentation for the Beatrice Sterling Irrevocable Trust," Harrison stated, his deep baritone voice cutting cleanly through the noise of the city traffic. "As of this exact moment, your father's fraudulent conservatorship is legally and permanently voided. The federal court has officially restored your status as the sole, uncontested beneficiary of the estate." I reached out and took the heavy leather folio from his hands. The physical weight of the documents was incredibly anchoring. It represented my grandmother's legacy, my stolen youth, and the ultimate weapon I had used to secure my own absolute liberation. Harrison tapped the leather cover of the folio with his index finger. The $30 million in liquid capital, along with the recovered commercial property deeds and the offshore holding accounts Charles attempted to drain, are entirely under your autonomous control. The asset freeze on your parents' accounts guarantees full restitution. There are no remaining legal tethers. There are no familiar loopholes for them to exploit. You are completely and utterly sovereign. I looked at the polished legal titan standing before me. He had been the brilliant architect of my retaliation, the razor-sharp sword I wielded against my father's corporate corruption. We had spent months mapping the illicit flow of funds, building an airtight case that even the most expensive defense attorneys could never dismantle. "Thank you, Harrison," I said, my voice steady and resolute. "Thank you for executing the strategy flawlessly, for ensuring they had absolutely no avenue of escape when the trap finally snapped shut." Harrison offered a rare, genuine smile that briefly softened his intimidating courtroom facade. "It was a privilege, Ava," he replied smoothly. "Men like your father believe they can manipulate the financial laws to serve their insatiable greed. They view other human beings as disposable assets. It is always deeply, profoundly satisfying to remind them that the law possesses very sharp teeth. Your grandmother would be exceptionally proud of the predator you have become tonight." I stepped into the luxurious, quiet cabin of the Maybach. The interior smelled of rich leather and quiet success. Harrison closed the heavy door shut behind me, instantly muting the chaotic, aggressive sounds of the city. He walked around to the front passenger seat, slipping inside to join his private driver. As the car pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the restaurant and the smoking ruins of the Miller family far behind in the rearview mirror, I opened the leather folio resting on my lap. The numbers printed on the pristine white pages were no longer a source of extortion, manipulation, or trauma. They were simply capital. They were the foundation of an empire I was going to build entirely on my own terms. My parents had invited me to dinner to discard me like a depreciated asset. They had tried to tell me I was a failure because I refused to play their fraudulent games. But sitting in the back of the Maybach, watching the bright neon lights of Manhattan blur past the tinted windows, I knew exactly what my net worth was. I closed the folio, resting my hands over the gold-embossed crest. I took one final deep breath, finally stepping completely out of the darkness of their abuse and looking forward to a brilliantly illuminated future. 6 months is an eternity in the financial district of Manhattan. In half a year, formidable corporate empires can be built from absolute scratch, and supposedly untouchable legacy institutions can be reduced to dust. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office, looking down at the chaotic, pulsing energy of the city streets far below. The heavy oak door behind me bore a freshly engraved brass plaque that gleamed under the recessed lighting: Vice President of Appraisals and Acquisitions. The board of directors at the auction house had not hesitated for a single moment when the dust finally settled from my family's highly public implosion. My immaculate handling of the fraudulent consignments, combined with the sudden, highly publicized legal backing of Harrison Brooks, made my executive promotion an undeniable corporate necessity. I was no longer just examining brushstrokes in a back room. I was actively dictating the flow of international art commerce. Resting squarely in the center of my expansive mahogany desk was a thick, pristine portfolio. It did not contain extortion demands or fabricated tax liabilities designed to destroy my life. It contained the finalized, federally approved charter for the Beatrice Sterling Foundation. I had taken the $30 million Charles had desperately tried to steal and repurposed it into an aggressive, highly regulated philanthropic trust. We provided elite legal representation and financial sanctuary for young adults escaping abusive, financially manipulative family structures. I had turned my grandmother's money into the exact weapon I had needed when I was 17 years old and trapped in a psychiatric ward. It was a beautiful, impenetrable fortress of legitimate capital, and it was entirely under my absolute autonomous control. A sleek flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall of my office was tuned to a premier financial news network. The volume was muted, but the scrolling ticker at the bottom of the screen delivered the breaking headline with brutal, inescapable clarity. Former corporate accounting chief Charles Miller, sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. I picked up the remote control and unmuted the broadcast, just in time to hear the anchor detail the spectacular, catastrophic end of my father. The federal judge had shown absolutely zero leniency during the sentencing hearing. The pristine audio recording of Charles actively attempting to bribe an agent of the Internal Revenue Service had completely dismantled his expensive, desperate defense strategy. There were no lenient plea deals available for a man who had utilized international auction houses to launder stolen trust fund money. The court ordered the immediate, permanent forfeiture of his entire remaining financial portfolio. His corporate pension was seized by the government. His accounting licenses were permanently and publicly revoked. The broadcast showed a brief, humiliating clip of Charles being escorted out of the federal courthouse by armed marshals. He was wearing a faded, standard-issue beige prison uniform that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His silver hair was unkempt, his face gaunt and deeply aged by the sheer, unrelenting terror of his new reality. He looked remarkably small. He looked entirely defeated. The man who had once threatened to destroy my career with a single phone call was now officially assigned a federal inmate number. He was locked inside a concrete cell where his manipulative tactics and his obsession with high society status held absolutely zero currency. The news anchor transitioned smoothly to discuss the collateral damage of the Miller financial syndicate. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my morning espresso. The television segment displayed a photograph of Grant, my former golden child brother, looking completely shell-shocked on the steps outside a federal bankruptcy court. His wealthy fiancée, Bianca, had completely severed all ties within 48 hours of the restaurant confrontation. She had taken her family's shipping fortune and her pristine credit score with her, leaving Grant totally exposed. Without my stolen inheritance to cover his massive cryptocurrency margin calls and his predatory shadow loans, Grant had faced immediate, catastrophic insolvency. The bankruptcy judge had aggressively scrutinized his fraudulent mortgage application for the Tribeca townhouse. Grant was forced to legally liquidate every single luxury asset he possessed just to avoid joining our father in a consecutive federal prison sentence. The imported Aston Martin was repossessed by the bank. The designer suits and vintage watches were auctioned off to satisfy his angry creditors. But the absolute peak of his systemic humiliation was the court-ordered community service. Harrison Brooks had forwarded me a highly detailed legal update just this morning regarding my brother's current employment status. Grant was currently mandated to serve 1,000 hours of manual labor to satisfy the terms of his plea agreement regarding the forged property deeds. The boy who had been handed the world on a silver platter, who had never worked a legitimate day in his entire life, was now required to wear a bright orange, high-visibility safety vest. He was officially assigned to a roadside sanitation crew operating on the blistering, exhaust-choked shoulders of the interstate highway. He spent his days carrying a sharp metal stick and a thick, heavy plastic bag. The golden child was currently spending his youth picking up discarded fast food wrappers, soiled napkins, and empty soda bottles under the relentless, unforgiving sun while semi-trucks roared past him. I muted the television again, letting the quiet, refined atmosphere of my executive office wash over me. The poetic justice of our reversed roles was magnificent. Grant was currently collecting worthless garbage off the asphalt, while I sat in a high-security vault authenticating priceless masterpieces. They had spent 3 decades trying to convince me that I was the flawed, defective component of their perfect family machine. They had demanded I sacrifice my future, my freedom, and my financial stability to maintain their shallow, materialistic illusions. They had handed me a gold-plated pen and ordered me to sign my own death warrant. Instead, I had rewritten the entire narrative. I had excised the cancerous tumors from my life with surgical, unyielding precision. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or lingering sadness for the people I had systematically dismantled. Guilt requires a foundation of misplaced affection, and I had completely depleted my reserves of affection for Charles and Grant long ago. I had meticulously engineered a reality where my competence was rewarded and their corruption was severely punished. I picked up my pen, a sleek, reliable instrument I had purchased with my own legitimate earnings, and signed the final authorization for a foundation grant. The ink flowed smoothly across the page, solidifying my promise to ensure no one else would ever be treated as a disposable tax break. The grand ballroom of the historic Manhattan Hotel was a fortress of absolute opulence. I stood near the edge of the main stage, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored emerald silk suit. The room was packed with the most influential art collectors, hedge fund executives, and international gallery owners in the city. Tonight was the inaugural charity auction for the Beatrice Sterling Foundation. We were auctioning off a curated selection of post-war contemporary art, and every single dollar of the buyer premiums was going directly into the fund I controlled. I was no longer an invisible appraiser working in the background. I was the vice president presiding over the entire event, commanding a room filled with people whose combined net worth exceeded the gross domestic product of several small nations. While I was orchestrating a multi-million-dollar philanthropic enterprise, the universe was simultaneously finalizing the complete, devastating ruin of my mother. The federal government operates with a cold, mechanical efficiency when recovering stolen capital. The massive Connecticut estate that Lydia had treated as her personal aristocratic kingdom had been aggressively seized by the bank. The foreclosure process was swift and entirely merciless. Federal marshals had arrived on a Tuesday morning, executing a total asset liquidation to satisfy Charles's massive tax deficit and the court-ordered restitution. Lydia was given exactly 2 hours to vacate the premises. She was stripped of her designer wardrobe, her imported furniture, and her collection of luxury vehicles. She was left standing on the curb with 2 standard suitcases containing whatever basic, unbranded clothing the federal agents allowed her to keep. Lydia had spent the last 30 years cultivating an identity entirely dependent on stolen wealth and superficial social status. She possessed absolutely no college degree, no marketable skills, and no relevant work history. When her wealthy friends realized she was married to a convicted federal felon and completely bankrupt, they blocked her phone number and erased her from their social registries overnight. Facing imminent homelessness, the former country club matriarch was forced to register with a low-tier minimum-wage temporary staffing agency just to afford a cramped studio apartment in a decaying industrial neighborhood. I took a sip of sparkling water, reviewing the auction catalog one final time before taking the podium. A few feet away from me, an intoxicated hedge fund manager gestured wildly during a conversation and knocked his crystal glass of Cabernet Sauvignon off a high-top cocktail table. The dark red wine shattered against the pristine white marble floor, sending glass shards and dark liquid splashing across the walkway. The event coordinator immediately tapped his earpiece discreetly, radioing for the venue cleaning staff to handle the hazard before the main auction commenced. Within 30 seconds, a worker pushing a heavy gray plastic utility cart hurried through the service doors. The worker wore a shapeless, faded polyester uniform that hung awkwardly on a noticeably thinning frame. She kept her head bowed down completely, avoiding eye contact with the wealthy patrons, radiating the distinct heavy posture of a person thoroughly broken by life. She parked the cart and immediately dropped to her knees right next to my designer heels. She pulled a thick cotton rag and a bottle of industrial chemical spray from her utility belt. She began frantically wiping the spilled red wine off the marble, her hands shaking slightly from the physical exertion. I looked down at the top of her head. I noticed the stark, uncolored gray roots growing out from what used to be meticulously maintained blonde hair. I noticed the rough, chapped skin on her bare hands, completely devoid of the $250,000 diamond tennis bracelets she used to flash in my face. The worker reached out to wipe a drop of wine that had splashed dangerously close to the tip of my emerald silk trousers. As she did, she briefly glanced up to ensure she did not soil the guest's expensive clothing. Her gaze traveled up my tailored suit and locked directly onto my face. The rag slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the wet marble floor with a wet smack. Lydia stopped breathing. Her eyes widened into massive, horrified saucers. The sheer, unadulterated humiliation of the moment crashed over her with the force of a freight train. The woman who had spent her entire existence judging people by their tax brackets, who had literally called me a worthless financial burden, was now kneeling on a hard floor, wearing a cheap polyester uniform, scrubbing spilled wine from under my shoes. I did not gasp. I did not step back. I looked down at the pathetic, trembling woman kneeling at my feet with an expression of absolute Arctic indifference. "Ava," Lydia whispered. Her voice was a cracked, desperate wheeze. She scrambled backward on her knees, desperately trying to hide her face behind her rough, unmanicured hands. Her face burned with a chaotic, agonizing mixture of deep shame and visceral terror. She looked around the grand ballroom, suddenly realizing that this event was entirely populated by the exact caliber of high society elites she had spent her life trying to impress. She realized I was the executive hosting the gala. The contrast between our current realities was absolute and completely inescapable. I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of luxury and power. She was quite literally scrubbing the floor beneath me. "You missed a spot, Lydia," I said. My voice was low, perfectly controlled, and completely empty of any familial warmth. Lydia let out a quiet, suffocating sob. She kept her head bowed, staring at the shattered glass and the spilled wine. She did not dare look up at me again. She knew she had absolutely no right to ask for my help. She knew she had destroyed every single bridge back to a comfortable life the night she ordered me to sign a federal felony confession. She slowly reached out with a trembling, calloused hand, picked up the saturated rag, and continued to wipe the floor directly in front of my shoes. I did not offer her a word of comfort. I did not hand her a crisp $100 bill out of pity. Pity is reserved for victims of circumstance, and Lydia was entirely the architect of her own spectacular destruction. She had chosen greed over her own daughter. Now she was paying the ultimate humiliating price for that decision. I stepped smoothly over the wet spot on the marble, completely bypassing the kneeling, sobbing woman. The crowd grew silent as I approached the center stage. The bright spotlight hit my face, illuminating my presence to the entire room of billionaires and art titans. I stepped up to the mahogany podium, tapped the microphone, and offered a brilliant, commanding smile to the audience. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice carrying flawless confidence and unshakable authority. "Welcome to the inaugural auction for the Beatrice Sterling Foundation. Tonight, we are investing in a future where human value is never dictated by a balance sheet." I did not look back at the service doors. I knew Lydia was quietly pushing her plastic cart back into the shadows where she belonged, taking her shame and her minimum wage reality with her. I raised my auction gavel, entirely ready to conquer the rest of my life. I stood at the mahogany podium, looking out over a sea of billionaires and industry titans. The auction was a monumental success. We raised millions for the Beatrice Sterling Foundation in a single evening. But as the final hammer fell and the applause thundered through the grand ballroom, my mind briefly wandered back to the service doors where Lydia had disappeared. I did not feel a sudden urge to chase after her. I did not feel the need to gloat or deliver a grand cinematic speech about my triumph in her catastrophic failure. Silence is the most absolute form of destruction. When you hate someone, you still acknowledge their existence. When you completely ignore them, you erase them from your reality. Lydia wanted me to scream. She wanted me to berate her because any reaction would have meant she still held emotional power over me. By stepping over her spilled wine and walking to the stage without a backward glance, I gave her the exact punishment she truly deserved. Absolute crushing insignificance. She was no longer my mother. She was just a temporary cleaning staff member who missed a spot on the marble floor. I never saw her again after that night. I never checked the employee registry to see if she kept the job. I simply closed that dark chapter of my life and threw away the book. Autumn arrived in New York City with a crisp, biting wind that stripped the golden leaves from the trees in Central Park. The holiday season used to be a psychological minefield for me. Thanksgiving with the Miller family was always a highly choreographed corporate event. Charles would spend the dinner discussing quarterly earnings, offshore accounts, and tax loopholes. Lydia would critically evaluate my wardrobe and compare my salary to the wealthy fiancé Grant brought home. It was a sterile, transactional nightmare disguised as a family gathering. This year was entirely different. I hosted Thanksgiving dinner in my newly purchased Upper West Side brownstone. The space was warm, inviting, and filled with the rich aromas of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and fresh cranberry sauce. There were no hostile caterers. There were no public relations consultants. There were no financial agendas hidden beneath the silver serving platters. I stood in my open-concept kitchen, pouring a bold, full-bodied Pinot Noir into crystal glasses. The people gathered in my dining room were not tied to me by genetics or legal obligation. They were tied to me by mutual respect, shared battles, and unwavering loyalty. My lead appraisal team from the auction house sat at the end of the long oak table, laughing loudly at a shared joke. They were the brilliant, meticulous professionals who had helped me securely flag Charles Illicit's art consignments without asking questions. Sitting right across from them was Harrison Brooks. The formidable legal titan had traded his intimidating charcoal suit for a comfortable cashmere sweater. He was currently debating the historical accuracy of a 19th-century painting with my lead researcher, a rare, genuine smile softening his usually severe features. Harrison had transitioned from my ruthless defense attorney to a trusted mentor, filling the paternal void Charles had left completely empty. He guided my foundation with a fiercely protective instinct, ensuring the wealth my grandmother left behind was weaponized for good and protected from any outside predators. I picked up my wine glass and walked into the dining room. The ambient chatter died down as I approached the head of the table. The fire crackled warmly in the stone fireplace behind me, casting a golden, flickering glow across the faces of the people I trusted most in the world. I looked around the room, taking a moment to fully absorb the profound beauty of the life I had constructed from the ashes of my past. There was no anxiety tightening my chest. There was no fear of impending betrayal. There was only absolute peace. The legal battles were over. The assets were secure. The toxic bloodline was severed. I tapped my silver fork against the rim of my crystal wine glass. The sharp, clear chime echoed perfectly through the room, drawing everyone's attention. They turned to me with expressions of genuine affection and respect. Nobody was looking at their watches. Nobody was calculating their return on investment for attending my dinner. I raised my glass high. The deep red wine caught the firelight. "I want to thank every single one of you for being here tonight," I began, my voice steady and radiating a profound, unshakable warmth. Exactly 1 year ago, I sat at a dinner table and was handed a document designed to destroy my life. I was told that my only value in this world was my ability to act as a financial shield for corrupt people. I was told I was entirely alone. I paused, meeting Harrison's eyes. He offered a slow, deeply respectful nod. "But looking around this room right now," I continued, "I realize exactly how wealthy I truly am. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the Beatrice Sterling Foundation trust accounts or my executive position at the auction house. I learned a very brutal, very necessary lesson this year. I learned that family is not defined by the people who share your blood and measure your worth by a tax return. Family is not an inherited obligation you have to suffer through. Family is a conscious daily choice. Family is the people who choose to stand beside you and protect you when you have absolutely zero exploitation value left. I extended my glass toward them, looking at the bright, smiling faces of my chosen tribe. To my real family, I said clearly, Happy Thanksgiving. The entire table raised their glasses in unison. The warm, resonant sound of crystal clinking together filled the room, a perfect symphony of authentic connection and absolute freedom. I took a sip of my wine, surrounded by the incredible life I had fought so ruthlessly to secure, and let the warmth of the evening completely consume the cold ghosts of my past. I had finally found my way home. Society frequently conditions us to believe that biological family is an unbreakable, sacred bond, a mandatory relationship we must endure, regardless of how deeply it damages our mental, emotional, or financial well-being. The story of Ava systematically dismantling her parents' extortion attempt utterly shatters this dangerous illusion. The most profound lesson to extract from this narrative is that sharing DNA does not grant anyone a free pass to exploit, belittle, or manipulate you. When the people who are fundamentally supposed to nurture and protect you view you as nothing more than a line item on a balance sheet or a convenient scapegoat for their own failures, you owe them absolutely no loyalty. Ava's journey teaches us that true power never comes from begging for a seat at a table where you are fundamentally disrespected. Instead, true power is realized when you have the courage to stand up, walk away, and meticulously build your own table. For decades, her parents attempted to convince her she was a worthless disappointment. Rather than internalizing their narcissistic abuse, she armed herself with unshakable competence, absolute financial independence, and cold, undeniable facts. She proved that your value is never, under any circumstances, tied to the validation of toxic people. Ultimately, the greatest wealth you can ever accumulate is a chosen family, a circle of trusted colleagues, mentors, and friends who stand fiercely by your side when you have zero exploitation value left to offer. Walking away from a corrupt bloodline is not an act of failure. It is the ultimate triumphant declaration of profound self-love and self-preservation.